In the year 120 BC, the death of Mithridates V marked a pivotal moment in the history of Pontus, and though none could foresee it at the time, the beginning of a series of conflicts that would shake the Roman Republic to its foundations. The throne passed to his 11-year-old son, Mithridates VI Eupator, whose very name proclaimed his divine ancestry, beloved of his father in Greek, linking him to the Persian royal lineage that the Pontic dynasty claimed through Darius the Great. Yet the young prince's path to absolute power would be neither swift nor bloodless. The regency established for the minor king included his mother, Laodice VI, who had married her own brother according to Hellenistic royal custom. This arrangement, intended to preserve dynastic legitimacy, instead became a source of immediate instability. Laodice clearly favoured her younger son, Mithridates Crestus, viewing him as a more malleable heir to Pontic power. The court at Sinope buzzed with intrigue, as various factions aligned themselves with either brother, each seeking to position themselves advantageously for the future. Mithridates VI, despite his youth, demonstrated an acute awareness of his precarious position. Ancient sources describe a young man of imposing physical presence, tall and powerfully built, with the aquiline features characteristic of his Persian ancestry. His education followed the Greek model favoured by Hellenistic monarchs, encompassing rhetoric, philosophy, mathematics, and military strategy, yet he also maintained strong connections to the Persian traditions of his forebears. This dual cultural identity would later prove instrumental in his ability to appeal to diverse populations across Asia Minor. The young king's response to the threats surrounding him revealed a calculating intelligence that would characterise his entire reign. Rather than remain at court where assassination attempts could be easily orchestrated, Mithridates VI embarked on what contemporary sources describe as extended hunting expeditions in the rugged mountains of Pontus. These journeys served multiple purposes. They removed him from immediate physical danger while allowing him to build relationships with local chieftains and tribal leaders who controlled the kingdom's interior regions. During these formative years, Mithridates developed the physical prowess that would become legendary throughout the ancient world. He reportedly could outride any of his companions, required minimal sleep, and possessed such resistance to poisons that he regularly consumed small doses of various toxins to build immunity, a practice that would later give rise to the term Mithridatism. These expeditions also allowed him to study the terrain of his kingdom intimately, knowledge that would prove invaluable in future military campaigns. The geopolitical landscape of Asia Minor in the late 2nd century BE presented a complex tapestry of competing authorities and overlapping jurisdictions. Roman power, established through the acquisition of the Attalid inheritance in 133 BC, centred on the new province of Asia, which encompassed much of western Anatolia. The Romans governed this territory through a proconsular system, with governors typically serving one-year terms before returning to Rome. This rapid turnover often prevented the development of consistent long-term policies and created opportunities for local strongmen to exploit administrative gaps. Beyond direct Roman control lay a network of client kingdoms and autonomous Greek cities, each maintaining varying degrees of independence while acknowledging Roman supremacy. The Galatian tribes, descendants of Celtic migrants who had settled in central Anatolia 3 centuries earlier, controlled substantial territories under their own kings, but remained nominally subject to Roman oversight. Cappadocia, under the Ariarathed dynasty, maintained its independence through careful diplomatic manoeuvring, while Bithynia's Nicomedeid rulers had long cultivated close ties with Rome. The Greek cities of the coast, Ephesus, Miletus, Pergamon, and dozens of others, existed in a state of theoretical autonomy, their ancient democratic or oligarchic institutions still functioning but constrained by the reality of Roman power. These communities had initially welcomed Roman intervention as liberation from Seleucid oppression, but the subsequent decades had brought growing disillusionment with their new masters. The Romans' practical approach to governance focused primarily on extracting revenue and maintaining order, often clashed with Greek expectations of cultural respect and administrative sophistication. Pontus itself occupied a unique position within this regional framework. The kingdom had emerged in the early 3rd century BC when Mithridates I, a Persian nobleman, established independence in the wake of Alexander's conquests. Successive rulers had gradually expanded Pontic's territory along the southern shore of the Black Sea, incorporating Greek coastal cities and indigenous Anatolian populations. By the time of Mithridates VI's accession, Pontus controlled a strategic position linking the Black Sea trade routes with the interior of Asia Minor, generating substantial revenue from customs duties and commercial activities. The kingdom's population reflected this geographic and historical complexity. Greek cities along the coast maintained their Hellenic character and institutions, while the interior remained predominantly Anatolian, with Persian and other Iranian elements concentrated around the royal court. This diversity created both opportunities and challenges for Pontic rulers, requiring sophisticated administrative systems to manage competing cultural and economic interests. As Mithridates VI matured and consolidated his position within Pontus, he began implementing an ambitious program of territorial expansion that would fundamentally alter the regional balance of power. His first major target was Colchis, the legendary homeland of Medea located on the eastern shore of the Black Sea. This region, rich in gold and other precious metals, had maintained nominal independence under local rulers while serving as a crucial link in the trade networks connecting the Mediterranean world with the Caucasus and Central Asia. The conquest of Colchis required careful planning and execution. Mithridates could not rely solely on military force, given the difficult terrain and the region's distance from Pontic population centres. Instead, he employed a combination of diplomacy, economic pressure, and strategic marriages to gradually extend Pontic influence. Local chieftains were offered advantageous trading arrangements and positions within the expanding Pontic administrative system, while those who resisted faced coordinated military campaigns that exploited Pontus's superior naval capabilities. The incorporation of Colchis brought immediate strategic benefits to Pontus. Control of the region's gold mines provided substantial new revenue streams, while access to Caucasian trade routes opened opportunities for expansion into previously untapped markets. Perhaps most importantly, Colchis served as a launching point for further expansion into the Crimean Bosporus, where Greek cities had maintained precarious independence for centuries while paying tribute to various Scythian and Sarmatian tribes. Mithridates' expansion into Lesser Armenia followed a similar pattern of gradual infiltration and eventual annexation. This mountainous region, located between Pontus proper and the larger Armenian kingdom, ruled by the Artaxiad dynasty, had long served as a buffer zone between competing powers. Local Armenian nobles, faced with pressure from both the expanding Parthian Empire to the east and the growing power of Greater Armenia to the north, proved receptive to Pontic overtures promising protection and profitable alliances. The king's approach to Lesser Armenia demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of regional politics and cultural sensitivities. Rather than imposing direct Pontic rule, he initially established a protectorate system that preserved local Armenian institutions while ensuring Pontic control over foreign policy and military affairs. This arrangement allowed him to tap into the region's considerable military potential. Armenian heavy cavalry and infantry had long been renowned throughout the Near East, while avoiding the administrative burdens and potential resistance that direct annexation might have provoked. The most audacious and ultimately most significant of Mithridates' early expansionist ventures was his intervention in the Crimean Bosporus. This region, centred on the Greek cities of Pantikapaeum and Chersonesos, controlled the vital grain trade between the Scythian territories north of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean world. For centuries, these cities had maintained their independence through a combination of military strength, diplomatic skill, and regular tribute payments to local barbarian tribes. By the late 2nd century BC, however, the traditional balance of power in the region had become increasingly unstable. Scythian power was waning under pressure from Sarmatian tribes migrating westward from the steppes, while the Greek cities found themselves unable to maintain their military forces at levels sufficient to guarantee continued independence. Appeals to various Mediterranean powers for assistance had yielded little concrete support, creating an opportunity that Mithridates was quick to exploit. The Pontic intervention in the Bosporus began with diplomatic overtures to the ruling dynasty of Pantikapaeum, offering military assistance against barbarian raids in exchange for commercial privileges and naval bases. When these negotiations proved insufficient to achieve his goals, Mithridates dispatched a substantial military force under the command of his most trusted general Diophantus. The subsequent campaigns, fought across the difficult terrain of the Crimean Peninsula and the surrounding steppes, demonstrated the effectiveness of Pontic military organisation and the king's strategic vision. Diophantus's forces, combining Pontic heavy infantry with local auxiliaries and allied tribal cavalry, proved superior to both the declining Scythian armies and the limited forces that the Greek cities could field independently. The capture of key strategic points along the coastline allowed Pontic forces to establish permanent bases, while successful campaigns against hostile tribes secured the land routes connecting the Crimean cities with their agricultural hinterlands. The incorporation of the Bosporan territories into the expanding Pontic sphere represented a triumph of strategic planning and military execution. Control of the region's grain exports provided Mithridates with both substantial revenue and a powerful diplomatic weapon that could be wielded against any Mediterranean power dependent on Black Sea agricultural products. The Greek cities themselves, with their experienced naval forces and established commercial networks, became valuable assets in the king's growing confrontation with Roman power. Meanwhile, Roman administration in the province of Asia was generating the very conditions that would make Mithridates' eventual challenge to Roman authority so devastatingly effective. The publicani system, developed to maximize revenue extraction from conquered territories, had created a network of Roman tax farmers whose primary concern was profit rather than provincial welfare. These publicani, typically members of the equestrian class who had purchased the right to collect specific taxes for predetermined periods, operated with minimal oversight from Roman magistrates, who were often more concerned with their own enrichment than with administrative efficiency. The practical operation of this system created numerous opportunities for abuse and exploitation. Tax farmers regularly demanded payments exceeding the amounts officially owed, using their connections with Roman officials to suppress complaints and resistance. Local populations found themselves subject to arbitrary assessments, forced loans, and various supplementary charges that bore little relationship to their actual economic capacity. Greek cities that had initially welcomed Roman rule as liberation from Seleucid oppression now discovered that their new masters could be equally rapacious and far less respectful of traditional privileges and customs. The situation was particularly acute in the rural areas of the province, where small farmers and agricultural communities lacked the resources and political connections necessary to resist publicani demands. Entire villages found themselves forced into debt servitude when unable to meet tax obligations, while their land was seized and sold to Roman investors or local collaborators. The traditional social structures that had maintained stability in these regions for centuries began to break down under the pressure of systematic exploitation. Urban communities fared somewhat better due to their greater resources and more sophisticated political organisations, but even the most prosperous Greek cities found their autonomy increasingly circumscribed by Roman financial demands. Municipal governments were required to guarantee tax payments from their territories, creating conflicts between local leaders and their constituents when Roman demands exceeded available resources. The ancient traditions of civic benefaction, whereby wealthy citizens funded public works and festivals, came under severe strain as private fortunes were depleted by Roman taxation and the opportunities for profitable investment diminished. These economic pressures were compounded by cultural tensions that reflected deeper incompatibilities between Roman and Greek approaches to governance and social organisation. Roman officials, trained in the pragmatic traditions of a republican administration, often displayed little patience for the elaborate protocols and ceremonial observances that remained central to Greek civic life. The Greeks, for their part, found Roman directness and focus on immediate results crude and disrespectful of the philosophical and artistic achievements that they considered the foundation of civilized society. Religious practices became another source of friction between Roman administrators and local populations. While Rome generally maintained a policy of religious tolerance, the practical implementation of this policy often reflected Roman prejudices and misunderstandings. Traditional festivals and ceremonies that required significant public expenditures came under scrutiny from officials concerned primarily with maximizing tax revenue. While the appointment of priests and religious officials increasingly reflected Roman political considerations rather than local religious traditions, the accumulation of these grievances created a reservoir of anti-Roman sentiment that extended across all levels of society in Asia Minor. Wealthy Greeks resented the limitations placed on their traditional political authority and the obstacles to profitable commercial activities. Urban craftsmen and merchants found their economic opportunities constrained by Roman competition and regulatory interference. Rural populations faced the immediate threat of dispossession and enslavement if unable to meet escalating tax demands. This widespread discontent did not immediately translate into organised resistance, largely because no credible alternative to Roman rule appeared available. The various client kingdoms and autonomous cities lacked the military strength to challenge Roman power directly, while appeals to other Mediterranean powers had proven fruitless. The Seleucid Empire, once the dominant force in the region, had collapsed into irrelevance following its defeat by Rome and subsequent partition. The Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt remained focused on its own survival in the face of Roman pressure and internal dynastic conflicts. Into this volatile situation stepped Mithridates VI, whose expanding power and demonstrated military capabilities offered the first realistic prospect of successful resistance to Roman domination. His victories in Colchis and the Crimean Bosporus had established his reputation as a formidable military commander, while his careful cultivation of relationships with various regional powers suggested sophisticated diplomatic skills. Perhaps most importantly, his Persian ancestry and claims to represent the legitimate traditions of pre-Roman Asia Minor resonated with populations seeking alternatives to their current circumstances. The king's agents began appearing throughout the region, carefully assessing local conditions and establishing contact with potential supporters. These emissaries, typically Greeks or Persians fluent in local languages and familiar with regional customs, operated with considerable discretion while gathering intelligence about Roman military dispositions, local political dynamics, and the extent of anti-Roman sentiment in various communities. The information they provided allowed Mithridates to develop detailed plans for coordinated action against Roman authority when the appropriate moment arrived. The intelligence network that Mithridates had carefully constructed throughout Asia Minor began reporting a series of developments that would provide the perfect pretext for war. In Cappadocia, the death of King Ariarathes VII in 101 BC had triggered a succession crisis that exposed the fundamental weakness of Rome's client kingdom system. The deceased king's legitimate heir, Ariarathes VIII, faced challenges from multiple claimants, including his own mother Laodicea, who had remarried the Pontic nobleman Gordius and now promoted her new husband's claims to the Cappadocian throne. The Romans, recognizing the strategic importance of Cappadocia as a buffer against both Pontic expansion and Parthian influence, threw their support behind Ariarathes VIII, while simultaneously attempting to install their own candidate in neighbouring Bithynia. The death of Nicomedes III of Bithynia in 94 BC had created a similar succession dispute, with the legitimate heir Nicomedes IV facing opposition from his half-brother Socrates, who enjoyed backing from various anti-Roman factions within the kingdom. Mithridates observed these developments with the calculating eye of an experienced strategist. The Roman position in both kingdoms remained precarious, dependent on local support that could evaporate if alternative leadership emerged. More importantly, Roman military resources in the region remained limited, with most legions committed to campaigns in Gaul, Spain, and other frontier regions. The proconsular forces stationed in Asia consisted primarily of auxiliary troops and local levies of questionable loyalty, hardly sufficient to maintain control if faced with coordinated resistance. The king's diplomatic offensive began in earnest during 91 BC, when he dispatched embassies to both Cappadocia and Bithynia, offering military assistance to the rival claimants opposed by Rome. These negotiations, conducted with characteristic Pontic discretion, promised substantial financial support and military advisors in exchange for formal alliances that would effectively place both kingdoms within Mithridates' sphere of influence. The terms offered were deliberately generous, reflecting the king's understanding that initial investment in reliable allies would yield far greater returns once Roman authority had been eliminated from the region. Roman intelligence services, such as they were, failed to detect the full scope of these diplomatic maneuvers until events had progressed beyond the point where peaceful resolution remained possible. The consul Manius Aquilius, dispatched to Asia Minor with a small force to resolve the succession disputes, discovered that both kingdoms were already effectively under Pontic influence by the time he arrived in the region. His attempts to negotiate directly with Mithridates through traditional diplomatic channels met with polite but evasive responses that suggested the Pontic king was merely buying time while completing his military preparations. The breakdown of diplomatic negotiations occurred during a series of meetings held at various locations along the Pontic-Cappadocian border throughout the winter of 89 BC. Aquilius, operating under instructions from the Senate to resolve the crisis without committing substantial Roman resources, found himself in the impossible position of making threats he lacked the military capacity to enforce. Mithridates, fully aware of Roman limitations, responded to each ultimatum with counter-proposals that would have effectively recognised Pontic hegemony over the disputed territories while maintaining the fiction of Roman oversight. The final diplomatic exchange took place in early 89 BC, when Aquilius delivered what amounted to an ultimatum demanding that Mithridates withdraw all support from the rival claimants and recognise Roman authority over both succession disputes. The Pontic king's response was delivered through his ambassador Pelopidas, a Greek noble whose careful phraseology could not disguise the fundamental rejection of Roman demands. Mithridates would consider withdrawing from Cappadocia only if Rome simultaneously recognised Pontic sovereignty over territories that included most of northern and eastern Asia Minor, terms that no Roman official could possibly accept without effectively abandoning the province of Asia. With diplomatic options exhausted, both sides began final preparations for military action. Aquilius, recognising that his forces were inadequate for the coming conflict, dispatched urgent requests to Rome for reinforcements, while attempting to organise local resistance from the client kingdoms and Greek cities still nominally loyal to Roman authority. His efforts were hampered by the widespread recognition that Roman military resources in the region were insufficient to guarantee protection for communities that openly supported the Roman cause. Mithridates launched his offensive in the spring of 88 BC with a coordinated assault that demonstrated years of careful planning and preparation. Rather than advancing directly against Roman positions, he began by securing his flanks through simultaneous invasions of Bithynia and Cappadocia that eliminated the rival claimants supported by Rome and installed his own candidates on both thrones. These campaigns, executed by separate armies under the command of experienced Pontic generals, achieved their objectives within weeks, while Roman forces remained concentrated around their primary bases in Western Asia Minor. The speed of Pontic success in these preliminary operations reflected both superior intelligence and more effective logistics. Mithridates had spent years cultivating relationships with local commanders and administrators in both kingdoms, ensuring that resistance would be minimal when his forces finally advanced. The armies themselves represented the culmination of decades of military reform and expansion, combining traditional Pontic heavy infantry with specialised units recruited from throughout the Black Sea region and equipped with the finest weapons and armour that royal workshops could produce. The Bithynian campaign unfolded with particular efficiency, as Pontic forces advancing from multiple directions converged on the capital at Nicomedia, while naval units secured the coastal cities that might otherwise have served as bases for Roman counterattacks. King Nicomedes IV, faced with the choice between flight and capture, abandoned his kingdom and fled to Roman protection, leaving his supporters to face Pontic retribution without royal leadership. The installation of Socrates as the new Bithynian king was accomplished through a carefully orchestrated ceremony that emphasized continuity with traditional royal customs, while making clear the kingdom's new orientation toward Pontus rather than Rome. Cappadocia proved even more receptive to Pontic intervention, as years of Roman interference in internal affairs had generated substantial resentment among the traditional nobility. The elimination of Ariarathes VIII was accomplished through a combination of military pressure and political manoeuvring that left Gordius in undisputed control of the kingdom. The new king immediately signed a formal alliance with Pontus that granted Mithridates access to Cappadocian military resources and strategic positions along the kingdom's southern borders. With his flanks secured and reliable allies installed in both neighbouring kingdoms, Mithridates turned his attention to the main prize, the Roman province of Asia. The campaign that followed would demonstrate not only the king's military capabilities, but also the extent of anti-Roman sentiment that had been building throughout the region for decades. Rather than relying solely on Pontic forces, Mithridates had coordinated his invasion with a network of local supporters who were prepared to rise against Roman authority once Pontic military success seemed assured. The invasion of Asia began with simultaneous assaults on multiple fronts, designed to prevent Roman forces from concentrating their limited resources for effective resistance. The main Pontic army, numbering approximately 250,000 infantry and 40,000 cavalry, according to contemporary sources, advanced westward from Cappadocia, while smaller forces moved south from Bithynia, and additional units landed at various points along the coastline. This multi-pronged assault forced Roman commanders to divide their already inadequate forces, while dealing with uprisings in their rear areas as local populations welcomed the Pontic advance. The fall of Pergamon, the former Attalid capital and one of the most important cities in the province, occurred within days of the invasion's commencement. The city's Greek population, resentful of decades of Roman exploitation, opened the gates to Pontic forces while the small Roman garrison retreated to the citadel before surrendering when their position became untenable. Mithridates' entry into Pergamon was orchestrated as a deliberate contrast to Roman administrative practices, with the king presenting himself as a liberator restoring traditional Greek freedoms rather than a conqueror imposing foreign rule. The enthusiastic reception that Mithridates received throughout the Greek cities of Asia Minor reflected genuine popular support rather than mere opportunism. Decades of Roman taxation and administrative interference had created widespread resentment that transcended class boundaries, uniting wealthy merchants and poor craftsmen in opposition to continued Roman rule. The king's agents had prepared the ground carefully, circulating propaganda that portrayed the Pontic advance as the restoration of Greek independence and the fulfillment of ancient prophecies about the eventual overthrow of Roman tyranny. Ephesus, the largest and most prosperous city in the province, surrendered without resistance when Pontic forces appeared before its walls. The city's population had already expelled the Roman tax farmers and their local collaborators, seizing their property and establishing a provisional government that immediately declared allegiance to Mithridates. Similar scenes were repeated throughout the region as communities that had maintained sullen submission to Roman authority for decades suddenly erupted in celebration at the prospect of liberation. The collapse of Roman military resistance proceeded with shocking rapidity as garrison after garrison found itself isolated and outnumbered by hostile local populations. Many Roman commanders, recognizing the hopelessness of their situation, negotiated surrender terms that allowed them to withdraw with their personal effects, while abandoning their official positions and military equipment to Pontic forces. Others attempted to maintain control through increasingly desperate measures, including the execution of suspected collaborators and the imposition of martial law, but these efforts only served to further alienate local populations and accelerate the general uprising. Aquilius himself, caught in the provincial capital of Pergamon when the city fell, managed to escape with a small bodyguard but found himself unable to rally effective resistance anywhere in the province. His attempts to reach the coast and secure passage to Rome were frustrated by the universal hostility of the local population and the presence of Pontic naval units that had seized control of most major ports. The former consul's eventual capture near the Bithynian border marked the effective end of organised Roman resistance in Asia Minor. The most shocking and historically significant event of the entire campaign occurred on a single day in 88 BC, when Mithridates implemented what would become known as the Ephesian Vespers Massacre. Secret orders, distributed throughout the region weeks in advance and coordinated to ensure simultaneous execution, called for the systematic elimination of all Roman and Italian civilians residing in the cities and towns of Asia Minor. The king's instructions were explicit and comprehensive. Every man, woman and child of Roman or Italian birth was to be killed, regardless of age, social status, or length of residence in the region. The massacre began at dawn in Ephesus and spread throughout the province as local populations, armed with lists of Roman residents prepared by Pontic agents, conducted house-to-house searches to identify and eliminate their targets. The killing was not random violence, but carefully organised genocide, designed to eliminate any possibility of Roman resurgence in the region. Entire families were dragged from their homes and murdered in public squares while crowds of Greek citizens watched and cheered. Roman merchants who had lived in Asia Minor for decades, their children who had been born in Greek cities, elderly veterans who had settled in the province after completing military service, all were killed without distinction or mercy. The scale of the slaughter was unprecedented in the ancient world. Contemporary sources, including both Pontic sympathisers and later Roman historians, agree that approximately 80,000 Roman and Italian civilians perished in a single day across Asia Minor. The killing was not limited to major cities, but extended to small towns and rural areas where even isolated Roman families were hunted down and eliminated. Local populations participated enthusiastically in many cases, settling decades of accumulated grievances through participation in the massacre. The systematic nature of the killings reflected careful advanced planning rather than spontaneous violence. Pontic agents had spent months identifying Roman residents and their properties, creating detailed lists that were distributed to local leaders, along with specific instructions for carrying out the massacre. The timing was coordinated to prevent any Romans from escaping to warn others, while the comprehensiveness of the operation ensured that potential sources of future resistance were eliminated completely. The psychological impact of the Ephesian Vespers extended far beyond its immediate military significance. The massacre demonstrated that Mithridates was prepared to wage total war against Roman authority, rejecting the traditional limitations that had governed conflicts between civilized powers. The king's willingness to order the systematic murder of civilians, including women and children, marked a fundamental escalation in the nature of the conflict and guaranteed that any eventual Roman response would be equally ruthless. News of the massacre reached Rome several weeks later, carried by the few survivors who had managed to escape the slaughter and make their way to Roman-controlled territories. The initial reports were dismissed as exaggerated accounts of routine military violence, but subsequent confirmations from multiple sources forced Roman authorities to confront the reality that an entire provincial population had been eliminated in a coordinated act of genocide. The Senate's response combined genuine shock at the scale of the atrocity with recognition that Roman prestige throughout the Mediterranean world had suffered a devastating blow. The collapse of Roman authority in Asia Minor created a power vacuum that Mithridates moved quickly to fill with his own administrative system. Rather than simply occupying conquered territory, the king implemented a comprehensive program of political and economic reform designed to consolidate local support while extracting maximum resources for the continuing war effort. Greek cities were granted extensive autonomy and encouraged to revive traditional democratic institutions that had been suppressed under Roman rule, while new commercial arrangements promised greater prosperity through integration with Pontic trade networks. The king's administrative appointments reflected careful attention to local sensibilities and political dynamics. Former Roman collaborators were eliminated or forced into exile, but established Greek families with histories of opposition to Roman rule were elevated to positions of authority within the new provincial government. This approach helped legitimize Pontic rule while ensuring that local administration would be conducted by individuals with genuine stakes in the success of the new regime. Economic policies implemented in the conquered territories demonstrated Mithridates' sophisticated understanding of the relationship between popular support and material prosperity. The oppressive tax system that had characterized Roman rule was immediately abolished and replaced with more moderate assessments that still provided substantial revenue for the royal treasury while allowing local communities to retain sufficient resources for recovery and growth. Confiscated Roman properties were redistributed to Greek citizens who had suffered under the previous regime, creating a substantial constituency with direct interests in preventing any restoration of Roman authority. The military implications of Mithridates' conquest extended far beyond the immediate territorial gains. Control of Asia Minor provided access to substantial human and material resources that could be mobilized for future campaigns, while the elimination of Roman naval bases along the Aegean coast left the eastern Mediterranean largely undefended against Pontic expansion. The king's forces now controlled strategic positions that could threaten Roman interests throughout the region, from the grain supply routes connecting Egypt with Italy to the commercial networks that linked Roman territories with eastern markets. Roman attempts to organise effective resistance from their remaining strongholds in Greece and the western Mediterranean were hampered by the speed of Pontic success and the comprehensive nature of the regional uprising. The few Roman officials who had escaped the initial conquest found themselves without reliable local support or adequate military resources to mount credible counterattacks. Appeals to allied communities throughout the Mediterranean world yielded limited assistance, as potential supporters recognised that Roman power in the east had suffered a potentially fatal blow. The strategic situation facing Rome in late 88 BC represented the most serious external threat to the Republic since Hannibal's invasion of Italy 2 centuries earlier. An enemy power had not only conquered substantial Roman territory, but had demonstrated the capacity to inspire coordinated resistance among populations that had previously accepted Roman rule. The systematic elimination of Roman civilians throughout Asia Minor had created conditions that made any negotiated settlement impossible, while guaranteeing that the eventual Roman response would be conducted with unprecedented ruthlessness and determination. The catastrophic news from Asia Minor reached Rome during the autumn of 88 BC, arriving at a moment when the Republic was already convulsing with internal political violence that would fundamentally alter the course of the Eastern War. The consul Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a patrician of ancient lineage whose family had fallen into relative obscurity before his own military successes revived their fortunes, found himself at the centre of competing claims for command of the forces that would be dispatched to restore Roman authority in the East. The Senate, recognising both the magnitude of the threat posed by Mithridates and Sulla's proven military capabilities demonstrated during the social war against Italian allies, formally assigned him command of the Eastern expedition with imperium sufficient to conduct operations throughout the Mediterranean world. Sulla's appointment represented a calculated decision by the conservative faction within the Senate, who viewed the patrician general as a reliable defender of traditional republican institutions against the populist challenges that had been mounting throughout the late 2nd century. His military record included successful campaigns in Africa under Marius and decisive victories during the recent social war, where his tactical innovations and personal leadership had proven instrumental in securing Roman victory over the Italian confederates. More importantly, from the Senate's perspective, Sulla had consistently aligned himself with optimate political positions that favoured aristocratic authority over popular assemblies and maintained traditional limitations on executive power. The new commander's strategic assessment of the eastern situation reflected both his military experience and his understanding of the broader political implications of the crisis. Roman authority in Asia Minor had not merely suffered a military defeat, but had been systematically eliminated through a coordinated uprising that demonstrated the fundamental weakness of the provincial system. The massacre of Roman civilians had created conditions that made any negotiated settlement impossible, while simultaneously providing Mithridates with resources and strategic positions that could threaten Roman interests throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Any effective response would require not only the reconquest of lost territory, but the complete destruction of Pontic military power and the implementation of administrative reforms that would prevent future rebellions. Sulla's initial planning focused on the fundamental strategic challenge posed by Mithridates' geographic position and alliance network. Direct assault on Pontic territory would require crossing either the Bosphorus or advancing through the difficult terrain of eastern Anatolia, both approaches that would expose Roman forces to attack while operating far from secure supply bases. The king's control of naval bases throughout the Black Sea and eastern Aegean provided him with strategic mobility that could allow Pontic forces to threaten Roman positions throughout the region, while avoiding decisive engagement on terms favourable to Roman legions. The solution that emerged from these strategic considerations reflected Sulla's sophisticated understanding of both military logistics and regional political dynamics. Rather than attempting immediate reconquest of Asia Minor, Roman forces would first secure control of Greece and the western Aegean, establishing forward bases that could support sustained operations against Pontic positions while denying Mithridates access to additional resources and potential allies. This approach would force the Pontic king to extend his lines of communication across increasingly hostile territory, while providing Roman forces with secure bases for the eventual advance into Anatolia. The implementation of this strategy required careful coordination between military and diplomatic initiatives, designed to isolate Mithridates from potential supporters while building a coalition capable of sustaining prolonged warfare. Sulla dispatched embassies throughout the Greek world, offering favourable terms to communities that had remained loyal to Rome while threatening severe punishment for those that had declared for Pontus. Simultaneously, agents were sent to establish contact with anti-Pontic factions within Asia Minor itself, laying the groundwork for eventual uprisings that would support Roman military operations. The domestic political crisis that erupted in Rome during the winter of 87 BC threatened to derail these carefully laid plans before military operations could commence. Gaius Marius, the ageing general whose victories over Jugurtha and the Cimbri had made him the most celebrated military commander of his generation, emerged from political retirement to challenge Sulla's appointment through manipulation of the popular assemblies. The tribune Publius Sulpicius Rufus introduced legislation transferring command of the eastern expedition from Sulla to Marius, arguing that the crisis required the leadership of Rome's most experienced general rather than a commander whose victories had been achieved primarily against Italian rather than foreign enemies. The political manoeuvring that followed revealed the depth of factional divisions that had been developing within the Roman political system throughout the previous decades. Sulla's supporters, concentrated among the traditional senatorial aristocracy, argued that legally granted imperium could not be arbitrarily transferred through popular legislation without setting dangerous precedents for future challenges to constitutional authority. Marius and his allies, drawing support from urban plebs and rural populations that had benefited from his previous military settlements, maintained that extraordinary circumstances justified extraordinary measures, and that the Republic's survival required the appointment of its most capable commander, regardless of normal procedural constraints. The crisis escalated when Sulla, rather than accepting the popular assembly's decision, chose to march on Rome with the legions that had been assembled for the Eastern campaign. This unprecedented action, no Roman general had ever led armed forces against the capital itself, reflected Sulla's calculation that constitutional principles took precedence over popular will, and that the Republic's institutions required protection against demagogic manipulation. The 6 legions under his command, composed primarily of veterans from the Social War who maintained personal loyalty to their commander, advanced on Rome while Sulla issued proclamations declaring his intention to restore legitimate governmental authority. The brief civil conflict that followed demonstrated both the fragility of Republican institutions and the extent to which personal loyalties had begun to supersede constitutional obligations within the Roman military system. Marius and his supporters, lacking organised military forces within the city, attempted to organise resistance through hastily armed urban militias and gladiatorial bands. But these improvised forces proved no match for disciplined legions commanded by experienced officers. The fighting that occurred within Rome itself was limited in scope but shocking in its implications, as Roman citizens found themselves engaged in armed conflict with their own military forces. Sulla's victory in this domestic confrontation was complete but Pyrrhic, as the precedent of marching on Rome would haunt the Republic for the remainder of its existence. Marius and his principal supporters fled into exile, while the consul implemented a series of constitutional reforms designed to strengthen senatorial authority and prevent future challenges to legally constituted government. These measures included restrictions on the legislative powers of popular assemblies and requirements that all major policy decisions receive prior approval from the Senate before being submitted to popular vote. With his domestic position temporarily secured, Sulla departed for the east in early 87 BC, leaving behind a political situation that remained fundamentally unstable despite his recent victory. The consul's absence from Rome would provide opportunities for his enemies to organise resistance, while the demands of the Eastern Campaign prevented him from maintaining direct oversight of domestic political developments. This division of attention between external military operations and internal political security would characterise Roman governance throughout the Mithridatic Wars, as the Republic's leaders struggled to maintain both foreign and domestic authorities simultaneously. The Roman expeditionary force that crossed from Brundisium to Apollonia in the spring of 87 BC represented one of the largest military concentrations that the Republic had assembled for foreign operations since the Punic Wars. 5 legions of heavy infantry, approximately 30,000 men, formed the core of Sulla's army, supported by substantial auxiliary forces recruited from Italian allies and supplemented by specialised units including Balearic slingers, Cretan archers, and Gallic cavalry. The logistical arrangements necessary to transport and supply this force across the Adriatic required extensive preparation and demonstrated the Republic's continued capacity for large-scale military operations despite the recent domestic upheavals. Sulla's arrival in Epirus coincided with disturbing intelligence reports indicating that Pontic influence had spread far beyond the initial conquests in Asia Minor. Mithridates had dispatched substantial forces under the command of his general Archelaus to secure control of key strategic positions throughout Greece, while Pontic agents had been active in encouraging anti-Roman sentiment among Greek communities that retained bitter memories of previous Roman interventions. The situation in Athens was particularly alarming, as the democratic faction led by Aristion had seized control of the city and declared allegiance to Pontus, while similar uprisings had occurred in other major Greek centres. The strategic situation that confronted Sulla required immediate action to prevent the consolidation of Pontic control over Greece and the Aegean islands. Archelaus had landed substantial forces at Piraeus and was using the port as a base for operations throughout central Greece, while additional Pontic forces were reportedly advancing through Thrace toward Macedonia. The Roman commander recognised that allowing these forces to establish permanent positions would create a strategic threat to Roman interests throughout the eastern Mediterranean, while providing Mithridates with forward bases for potential operations against Italy itself. The siege of Athens that commenced in the autumn of 87 BC would demonstrate both Sulla's tactical capabilities and his willingness to employ extreme measures to achieve military objectives. The city's formidable fortifications, strengthened during previous centuries of warfare, presented a significant challenge to Roman siege techniques, while the presence of Pontic naval forces at Piraeus complicated any attempt to establish a complete blockade. Sulla's approach combined traditional siege methods with innovative tactical adaptations designed to exploit specific weaknesses in Athenian defensive arrangements. The Roman siege lines, constructed according to established military engineering principles, completely encircled both Athens and its port at Piraeus, while maintaining secure communications between the two investment forces. These fortifications, built by legionary engineers under the supervision of experienced military architects, included elaborate systems of trenches, palisades and artillery positions that prevented any relief efforts, while protecting Roman forces from sorties by the besieged garrison. The construction of these works required several months of intensive labour, but created conditions that made the eventual fall of the city virtually inevitable. Sulla's conduct of the siege revealed his understanding that psychological warfare could be as effective as physical assault in achieving military objectives. Rather than attempting immediate assault on the city's walls, he implemented a systematic program of intimidation designed to undermine civilian morale, while demonstrating the futility of continued resistance. Roman artillery, including both traditional catapults and newer torsion engines, maintained constant bombardment of residential areas within the city, while public executions of captured Pontic sympathizers provided graphic demonstrations of the fate awaiting those who opposed Roman authority. The gradual tightening of the siege created increasingly desperate conditions within Athens, as food supplies dwindled and disease began spreading through the overcrowded population. Aristian's government, initially confident that Pontic relief forces would break the Roman blockade, found itself unable to maintain civilian support as the reality of their situation became apparent. Attempts to negotiate surrender terms were rejected by Sulla, who demanded unconditional capitulation and the surrender of all Pontic supporters for punishment as traitors to Roman authority. The final assault on Athens began before dawn on March 1st, 86 BC, when Roman forces simultaneously attacked multiple sections of the city's walls, while diversionary operations prevented the garrison from concentrating their defensive efforts. The main attack, directed against the Piraeus Gate where previous bombardment had weakened the fortifications, achieved breakthrough within hours as legionary infantry overwhelmed the demoralized defenders. Once Roman forces had established positions within the city, organised resistance collapsed as civilians fled toward the Acropolis, while Pontic soldiers attempted to escape toward the harbour. The sack of Athens that followed represented one of the most brutal episodes in the history of Roman warfare, as Sulla permitted his troops to engage in systematic pillaging and massacre that continued for 3 days. The general's decision to allow this violence reflected both his desire to punish the city for its betrayal of Roman authority and his recognition that examples of extreme brutality would discourage resistance in other Greek communities. Thousands of civilians were killed regardless of their political affiliations, while the city's artistic and cultural treasures were either destroyed or shipped to Rome as spoils of war. The destruction of Athens sent shockwaves throughout the Greek world, as communities that had been considering alignment with Pontus recognized the consequences of opposing Roman power. The systematic elimination of the city's intellectual and cultural elite, including philosophers, artists and scholars who had maintained Athens' reputation as the centre of Greek learning, demonstrated that Rome would tolerate no challenges to its authority, regardless of the cultural significance of the communities involved. This message was reinforced by Sulla's subsequent treatment of other Greek cities that had supported Pontus, as surrender was followed by confiscation of property, execution of leaders, and imposition of crushing financial penalties. The capture of Piraeus required separate operations, as the Pontic garrison under Archelaus had fortified the port and maintained naval communications with reinforcement forces in Asia Minor. Sulla's assault on these positions demonstrated the tactical innovations that would characterize his subsequent campaigns, as Roman forces employed coordinated attacks by land and sea that overwhelmed defensive positions through superior organization and equipment. The fall of Piraeus eliminated the principal Pontic naval base in Greek waters, while providing Roman forces with secure port facilities for future operations. With Athens secured and Pontic naval power in the Aegean significantly reduced, Sulla turned his attention to the elimination of remaining enemy forces in central Greece. Archelaus, having escaped from Piraeus with substantial portions of his army, had established new positions in Boeotia where he hoped to await reinforcements from Asia Minor, while organising resistance among Greek communities that remained hostile to Roman authority. The Pontic general's forces, estimated at approximately 110,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry, represented a formidable challenge that would require careful tactical planning to overcome. The Battle of Chaeronea, fought on the plains of central Boeotia in the summer of 86 BC, would demonstrate the tactical superiority of Roman military organisation over the diverse forces that Mithridates had assembled for his Greek campaign. Archelaus had positioned his army in a strong defensive position that took advantage of the local terrain while allowing maximum deployment of his superior numbers, but Sulla's tactical innovations neutralised these advantages through coordinated manoeuvres that exploited weaknesses in Pontic command and control systems. The Roman victory at Chaeronea shattered Pontic military power in Greece and forced Archelaus to retreat with the remnants of his army toward the coast, where Pontic naval forces still maintained tenuous control over several harbours. Sulla's pursuit was methodical and relentless, as Roman columns advanced along multiple routes to prevent the enemy from establishing new defensive positions while maintaining pressure that prevented any opportunity for reorganisation. The systematic destruction of Pontic forces in central Greece eliminated the immediate threat to Roman interests in the region, while demonstrating that Mithridates' military machine, despite its impressive size and initial successes, could be defeated by disciplined Roman tactics and superior leadership. The strategic implications of Sulla's Greek victories extended far beyond the immediate military gains, as news of Roman success began reversing the tide of regional opinion that had initially favoured Pontic expansion. Greek communities that had welcomed Mithridates as a liberator now recognised that Roman power remained formidable and that continued resistance would likely result in the same brutal punishment that had befallen Athens. Delegations from various cities began arriving at Sulla's headquarters, offering submission and requesting terms for a renewed alliance with Rome, while intelligence reports indicated growing dissension within Pontic-controlled territories as local populations reconsidered their allegiances. The diplomatic offensive that accompanied Roman military success reflected Sulla's sophisticated understanding of the relationship between military victory and political consolidation. Rather than simply accepting surrenders and moving forward with military operations, he implemented a comprehensive program designed to rebuild Roman authority throughout Greece, while creating conditions that would prevent future rebellions. Communities that had remained loyal to Rome throughout the crisis received substantial rewards, including tax reductions, territorial grants, and enhanced autonomy, while those that had supported Pontus faced varying degrees of punishment calibrated to their level of cooperation with enemy forces. The financial aspects of Sulla's settlement arrangements reveal the practical considerations that necessarily accompanied any restoration of Roman authority in the Eastern Mediterranean. The costs of maintaining substantial military forces in the field for extended periods had placed enormous strains on the Roman treasury, while the loss of tax revenue from Asia Minor had eliminated one of the Republic's most important sources of income. The commander's solution involved imposing massive indemnities on communities that had supported Pontus, while simultaneously offering favourable commercial arrangements to those that demonstrated renewed loyalty to Roman authority. These economic policies created immediate hardship for many Greek communities, but established foundations for long-term recovery that would ultimately benefit both local populations and Roman interests. The systematic confiscation of property belonging to prominent Pontic supporters provided resources for compensating Roman allies, while eliminating potential sources of future resistance. Simultaneously, the redistribution of confiscated assets to loyal supporters created new constituencies with direct interests in maintaining Roman authority and preventing any resurgence of anti-Roman sentiment. The military situation in early 85 BC had evolved to the point where Mithridates faced increasing pressure to seek negotiated settlement rather than continue a conflict that was depleting his resources without achieving decisive results. Roman control of Greece had eliminated his forward bases in the Western Aegean, while growing unrest within Asia Minor itself indicated that his initial popularity among Greek populations was beginning to erode under the pressures of sustained warfare. Intelligence reports reaching Pontic headquarters described widespread war weariness among civilian populations who had initially welcomed liberation from Roman rule but now faced the reality of military conscription, increased taxation, and economic disruption caused by the continuing conflict. The king's strategic position had been further complicated by developments in other theatres that required attention and resources that might otherwise have been devoted to the Roman war. Parthian forces had begun probing operations along Pontus's eastern frontiers, while various barbarian tribes in the Caucasus region were taking advantage of the kingdom's military commitments elsewhere to launch raids against Pontic territories. These secondary threats, while not immediately decisive, forced Mithridates to maintain substantial garrison forces in regions far from the primary theatre of operations and prevented the concentration of all available resources against Roman positions. Diplomatic contacts between the opposing sides began through intermediaries during the winter of 85 BC, as both Sulla and Mithridates recognised that their respective positions contained both strengths and vulnerabilities that made negotiated settlement potentially attractive. Roman envoys operating under carefully crafted instructions that balanced the need for decisive victory with recognition of practical limitations began exploring terms that might allow Mithridates to retain his core territories while accepting significant constraints on future expansion. Pontic representatives, meanwhile, sought arrangements that would preserve the king's dignity and essential interests while acknowledging the military realities that had emerged from the 2 years of warfare. The preliminary negotiations revealed fundamental differences in perspective that would require careful diplomatic management to overcome. Sulla, operating under Senate instructions that demanded both punishment for the massacre of Roman civilians and guarantees against future aggression, insisted on terms that would effectively reduce Pontus to client status while requiring substantial reparations for damages inflicted during the war. Mithridates, conscious of his need to maintain credibility with his own subjects and regional allies, sought arrangements that would preserve his independence and territorial integrity while offering only minimal concessions to Roman demands. The breakthrough in negotiations came when both sides recognised that their long-term interests might be better served by a settlement that restored the pre-war status quo, rather than attempting to achieve total victory through continued military operations. Sulla's position in Greece, while militarily dominant, remained dependent on maintaining substantial forces far from their supply bases and at considerable expense to the Roman treasury. Mithridates, despite his territorial losses and military defeats, still controlled most of his original kingdom and retained sufficient military strength to make any Roman invasion of Pontus itself a costly and uncertain proposition. The formal negotiations that led to the Treaty of Dardanus were conducted at a site chosen for its symbolic neutrality, located on the Asian shore of the Dardanelles, where neither party could claim territorial advantage. The Pontic delegation was led by the king's most trusted diplomatic advisor Bacchides, a Greek noble whose family had served Pontic interests for generations and whose reputation for both intelligence and reliability had been established through previous successful negotiations. Sulla represented Roman interests personally, recognising that the importance of these discussions require the direct involvement of the commanding general rather than delegation to subordinate officials. The treaty terms that emerged from these negotiations reflected the military realities that had developed over the course of the war, while acknowledging the political necessities that both sides faced in justifying settlement to their respective constituencies. Mithridates agreed to evacuate all territories outside his original kingdom boundaries, including Cappadocia, Bithynia, and the Greek cities of Asia Minor that had declared for Pontus during the initial uprising. The king would also surrender his naval forces beyond those necessary for coastal defence and pay a substantial indemnity of 2,000 talents to compensate Rome for the costs of military operations. In exchange for these concessions, Rome recognised Mithridates as a legitimate ruler within his ancestral territories and agreed to restore normal diplomatic relations that would allow renewed commercial and political interactions. The treaty specifically acknowledged Pontic sovereignty over the Black Sea territories that had been acquired before the outbreak of hostilities, including Colchis and the Crimean Bosporus, while establishing procedures for resolving future disputes through negotiation rather than military action. The prisoner exchange arrangements included in the treaty addressed one of the most sensitive issues arising from the conflict, as both sides held substantial numbers of captives whose fate had become a matter of political significance. Roman prisoners, including the former consul Lucullus, who had been captured during the initial Pontic advance, would be returned without ransom, while Pontic prisoners in Roman custody would receive similar treatment. The treaty specifically addressed the status of Greek civilians who had been enslaved during the sack of Athens and other cities, establishing procedures for their eventual return to their home communities. The implementation of the treaty terms required careful coordination between Roman and Pontic officials to ensure that military withdrawals proceeded smoothly without creating opportunities for disorder or renewed conflict. Sulla established a detailed schedule for the evacuation of Pontic forces from various territories, with specific deadlines and verification procedures designed to prevent any attempts at delay or deception. Pontic officials, meanwhile, organised the systematic transfer of administrative authority back to Roman control, while ensuring that their own forces withdrew in good order with their equipment and personal property intact. The restoration of Roman authority in Asia Minor proceeded gradually as Pontic forces completed their withdrawal and Roman administrators returned to resume their previous functions. The process revealed the extent of changes that had occurred during the years of Pontic occupation, as many communities had implemented new governmental arrangements and commercial relationships that could not simply be reversed through administrative decree. Sulla's approach to these complications demonstrated both pragmatic flexibility and determination to re-establish effective Roman control without creating unnecessary disruption to local populations. The punishment of communities that had supported Pontus during the war required careful calibration to achieve deterrent effects without destroying the economic foundations necessary for future tax collection and regional stability. Cities that had enthusiastically welcomed Pontic forces and participated in the massacre of Roman civilians faced severe penalties, including the execution of leading citizens, confiscation of public property, and imposition of crushing financial obligations that would require decades to fulfill. Communities that had submitted to Pontic authority under duress, or had provided only minimal cooperation, received more moderate treatment, while those that had attempted to protect Roman residents or had provided intelligence to Roman forces were granted favourable terms. The economic reconstruction of the province required massive infusions of capital and administrative expertise to restore the commercial networks that had been disrupted by years of warfare and political upheaval. Roman Publicani returned to resume their tax collection activities, but under modified arrangements that reflected both the reduced capacity of local populations to meet financial obligations and the lessons learned from the administrative failures that had contributed to the original uprising. The new system maintained Roman revenue requirements while providing greater predictability and reduced opportunities for arbitrary exploitation that had characterized the previous arrangements. The human cost of restoring Roman authority extended beyond the immediate casualties of military operations to include the systematic displacement of populations that had become politically compromised through their association with Pontic rule. Thousands of Greek families found themselves forced to abandon homes and businesses that had been confiscated as punishment for collaboration, while others faced ongoing suspicion and harassment that made normal life impossible. These displaced populations became a source of continuing instability throughout the region, as their resentment provided potential support for any future challenges to Roman authority. Mithridates utilised the interwar period that followed the Treaty of Dardanus to implement comprehensive military and administrative reforms designed to address the weaknesses that had been revealed during the recent conflict. The king's analysis of Roman tactical superiority led to fundamental changes in Pontic military organisation, as traditional formations based on Hellenistic models were gradually replaced with units trained and equipped according to Roman standards. Pontic workshops began producing standardised weapons and armour that matched Roman specifications, while training programs introduced disciplinary methods and tactical doctrines derived from careful study of Roman military practices. The recruitment policies implemented during this period reflected Mithridates' recognition that future success would require military forces capable of matching Roman legions in both individual combat effectiveness and unit cohesion. Traditional reliance on levies from subject populations was supplemented with professional soldiers recruited from throughout the Black Sea region and trained according to rigorous standards that emphasized physical conditioning, weapons proficiency, and unit discipline. These reforms required substantial financial investment, but created military capabilities that would prove significantly more effective in future conflicts. The diplomatic initiatives that Mithridates pursued during the interwar period demonstrated his understanding that Pontus could not successfully challenge Roman power through military means alone, but required alliance networks that could provide both material support and strategic diversions that would prevent Rome from concentrating all available resources against Pontic positions. Embassies were dispatched to courts throughout the Mediterranean world seeking partners who shared interests in limiting Roman expansion, while agents worked to establish contact with anti-Roman factions within territories under Roman control. The most significant of these diplomatic initiatives involved negotiations with Quintus Sertorius, the Roman general who had established an independent state in Spain following his opposition to Sulla's constitutional reforms. Sertorius represented both a potential military ally and a source of Roman military expertise that could assist in modernising Pontic forces, while his control of Spanish resources and strategic position in the Western Mediterranean offered possibilities for coordinated operations that would force Rome to divide its attention between multiple theatres. The alliance that eventually emerged from these negotiations would provide Mithridates with access to Roman military advisors and advanced weapons technology, while offering Sertorius potential support for his own operations against the Roman government. The internal consolidation that occurred within Pontus during this period involved systematic efforts to strengthen royal authority, while building popular support for future military operations against Rome. Administrative reforms centralised control over provincial governments and reduced the autonomy that local nobles had traditionally enjoyed, while new taxation systems provided increased revenue for military preparations without creating the kind of popular resentment that had undermined previous Pontic expansion efforts. Cultural policies emphasised Pontic achievements and destiny, while portraying Rome as a temporary obstacle to the restoration of Persian greatness in Asia Minor. The intelligence networks that Mithridates expanded throughout the Roman world during this period would prove crucial to the timing and coordination of future military operations. Agents operating under commercial or diplomatic cover established contacts within Greek communities throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, while others worked to identify potential supporters within Roman territories who might provide assistance during future conflicts. These networks provided detailed information about Roman military dispositions, political developments, and economic conditions that allowed Pontic planners to identify vulnerabilities and opportunities for effective action. The succession disputes that continued to plague Roman client kingdoms provided Mithridates with ongoing opportunities to extend Pontic influence while maintaining the appearance of compliance with treaty obligations. Cappadocia remained particularly unstable, as competing claimants sought external support for their respective causes, while Roman officials struggled to maintain effective oversight from distant provincial capitals. Pontic agents worked systematically to cultivate relationships with anti-Roman factions in these kingdoms, while providing covert support that stopped just short of open treaty violations. The uneasy peace established by the Treaty of Dardanus lasted barely 2 years before Roman ambition and Pontic preparations converged to reignite hostilities in Asia Minor. The catalyst for a renewed conflict emerged not from calculated policy decisions in Rome or Sinope, but from the personal ambitions of Lucius Licinius Murena, the Roman governor of Asia, who viewed Mithridates' apparent compliance with treaty obligations as evidence of weakness rather than diplomatic prudence. Murena, a competent but unremarkable officer who had served under Sulla during the siege of Athens, found himself commanding substantial military forces in a region where the recent war had demonstrated the potential for rapid territorial gains and enormous personal enrichment. The governor's assessment of regional conditions during 83 BC reflected both accurate observations about Pontic vulnerabilities and fundamental misunderstandings about Mithridates' strategic intentions. Pontic forces had indeed withdrawn from all territories specified in the Dardanus Agreement, while the king himself appeared focused on internal administrative reforms rather than military preparations for renewed conflict. Intelligence reports reaching Murena's headquarters in Pergamon described a Pontus engaged in peaceful reconstruction activities, with former military units being disbanded and royal attention directed toward commercial and diplomatic initiatives rather than aggressive expansion. These surface appearances concealed the reality of Mithridates' systematic preparation for future conflict, but Murena's intelligence apparatus lacked the sophistication necessary to penetrate Pontic security measures or accurately assess the king's long-term intentions. Roman agents operating within Pontus reported what they were allowed to observe, the visible signs of demobilization and peaceful development, without recognizing that these activities were carefully orchestrated to create precisely the impression of weakness that would encourage premature Roman aggression. The king's strategy relied on maintaining this deceptive posture until his military reforms had been completed and his alliance networks were sufficiently developed to support renewed conflict on more favourable terms. Murena's decision to initiate unauthorised military operations against Pontus stemmed from multiple converging factors that made aggressive action appear both feasible and profitable. The recent conclusion of the social war had left substantial numbers of veteran soldiers available for recruitment, while the ongoing civil conflicts between Marius and Sulla had created opportunities for ambitious commanders to build independent power bases through successful military campaigns. The governor recognised that decisive victory over Mithridates could provide the military reputation and financial resources necessary to advance his political career in Rome, where competition for high office required both demonstrated military capability and the wealth necessary to fund electoral campaigns. The strategic situation in Asia Minor appeared to favour Roman initiative, as Pontic military forces remained concentrated in their core territories, while the buffer kingdoms of Cappadocia and Bithynia maintained only minimal defensive capabilities. Murena calculated that rapid strikes against border regions could achieve substantial territorial gains before Mithridates could organise effective resistance, while the king's apparent reluctance to violate treaty obligations would prevent the kind of coordinated response that had characterised the previous war. This assessment proved fundamentally flawed, as it underestimated both Mithridates' military capabilities and his willingness to defend Pontic territory against unprovoked aggression. The initial Roman operations began in the spring of 83 BC with coordinated attacks against Pontic border fortifications along the Cappadocian frontier, where Murena had concentrated approximately 2 legions supported by auxiliary forces recruited from local client kingdoms. These assaults, conducted without formal declaration of war or authorization from the Roman Senate, achieved immediate tactical success, as surprised Pontic garrisons found themselves overwhelmed by superior numbers and better siege equipment. The capture of several minor strongholds provided Roman forces with forward bases for deeper penetration into Pontic territory, while yielding substantial quantities of military supplies and treasure that had been stored in these frontier positions. The Roman advance proceeded methodically as Murena's forces consolidated their initial gains before pushing deeper into Pontic territory toward more significant objectives. The governor's tactical approach emphasised rapid movement and concentrated assault against isolated positions, avoiding engagement with major Pontic field armies while systematically reducing the defensive infrastructure that protected the kingdom's borders. This strategy achieved considerable success during the initial phases of the campaign, as Roman engineering capabilities and superior siege techniques proved decisive against fortifications that had been designed primarily to delay rather than permanently halt enemy advances. The Siege of Comana, a fortified city that controlled key mountain passes linking Pontus with Cappadocia, demonstrated both the effectiveness of Roman tactical methods and the limited scope of Murena's strategic objectives. Rather than attempting to capture and hold this important position permanently, Roman forces conducted a systematic plundering operation that stripped the city of portable wealth while destroying military installations and supply depots. The civilian population was treated with relative restraint, reflecting Murena's recognition that excessive brutality might provoke the kind of massive retaliation that his limited forces could not withstand. Mithridates' initial response to these border incursions revealed the sophisticated defensive strategy that his military advisors had developed during the interwar period. Rather than immediately committing major forces to defend frontier positions, Pontic commanders implemented a flexible defense that traded territory for time while gathering intelligence about Roman intentions and capabilities. Local garrisons were instructed to conduct fighting withdrawals that inflicted maximum casualties on advancing Roman forces while preserving their own strength for eventual counterattacks when conditions became more favourable. The king's restraint during these early phases of the conflict reflected careful calculation rather than weakness or indecision. Mithridates recognised that Murena's operations lacked official Roman authorization and that premature escalation might provide Rome with justification for renewed full-scale war before Pontic preparations had been completed. The diplomatic communications that the king maintained with other Roman officials emphasised his continued commitment to the Dardanus Treaty, while requesting intervention to halt Murena's unauthorised aggression, strategy designed to exploit divisions within Roman leadership while maintaining the moral high ground in any future negotiations. The intelligence reports reaching Sinope during the summer of 83 BC provided detailed assessments of Roman military capabilities and strategic intentions that allowed Pontic commanders to develop appropriate countermeasures. Murena's forces, while competent and well-equipped, remained limited in both numbers and logistical support, making them vulnerable to coordinated counterattacks if they advanced too far from their supply bases. The governor's apparent focus on short-term tactical gains, rather than permanent territorial conquest, suggested that his operations were motivated by personal ambition rather than broader Roman strategic objectives, creating opportunities for diplomatic resolution that would avoid escalation to full-scale warfare. The first significant Pontic military response came in late 83 BC, when Mithridates authorized limited counterattacks against Roman positions that had become overextended during their advance into Pontic territory. These operations, conducted by carefully selected units under experienced commanders, demonstrated the improvements in Pontic military organisation that had been implemented during the interwar period. The troops involved displayed discipline and tactical coordination that matched Roman standards, while their equipment and weapons reflected the technological advances that Pontic workshops had achieved through systematic study of captured Roman materials. The battle fought near the village of Halys marked the first significant engagement between Roman and Pontic forces since the conclusion of the previous war, providing both sides with valuable intelligence about their respective military capabilities. Murena had positioned approximately 8,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry in a defensive position that controlled access to the main road connecting Pontus with Cappadocia, expecting that Pontic forces would attempt a direct assault that would allow Roman tactical superiority to achieve decisive victory. Instead, Mithridates' commanders implemented a sophisticated flanking maneuver that exploited their superior knowledge of local terrain while avoiding the kind of frontal engagement that favoured Roman formations. The Pontic assault began before dawn, with diversionary attacks against Roman forward positions that drew attention away from the main effort developing against the enemy's left flank. The primary attacking force, numbering approximately 12,000 infantry organised in formations that closely resembled Roman legionary structure, advanced through difficult terrain that Roman scouts had dismissed as impassable for large military units. These troops, trained according to the reformed standards that Mithridates had implemented, demonstrated both individual fighting skills and unit cohesion that surprised Roman commanders who had expected to face the same type of disorganised levies that had characterised Pontic forces during the previous war. The collapse of the Roman left flank occurred within hours of the initial Pontic assault, as units that had been positioned to guard against minor raids found themselves engaged with disciplined enemy formations that possessed both numerical superiority and tactical advantages derived from their intimate knowledge of the battlefield terrain. Murena's attempts to redeploy his reserves to counter the Pontic breakthrough were frustrated by the continuing diversionary attacks that prevented him from accurately assessing the scale and direction of the main enemy effort until his position had become untenable. The Roman withdrawal from the Halys position was conducted in good order despite the tactical defeat, reflecting the professional competence of Murena's officers and the discipline of veteran troops who had learned to maintain unit integrity under adverse conditions. Pontic forces pursued cautiously, inflicting additional casualties while avoiding the kind of reckless advance that might have allowed Roman commanders to organise effective counterattacks. The engagement demonstrated that Mithridates had succeeded in creating military forces capable of defeating Roman units under favourable conditions, while also revealing the continued limitations that prevented Pontic armies from achieving the kind of decisive victories that would force Rome to accept major territorial losses. The strategic implications of the Halys engagement extended beyond its immediate tactical results, as news of Roman defeat encouraged anti-Roman sentiment throughout Asia Minor, while demonstrating that Pontic military power remained formidable despite the setbacks of the previous war. Greek cities that had reluctantly accepted the restoration of Roman authority began reconsidering their allegiances, while various client kingdoms started exploring opportunities for reducing their dependence on Roman protection. These political developments created conditions that could support renewed Pontic expansion if Mithridates chose to escalate the conflict beyond its current limited scope. Murena's response to his tactical defeat revealed both his personal determination to achieve military success and his growing recognition that his forces were inadequate for the ambitious objectives he had originally envisioned. Rather than attempting to continue offensive operations with depleted resources, the governor implemented a defensive strategy that focused on consolidating Roman control over the territories already occupied while requesting reinforcements from other provincial commands. This strategic adjustment reflected practical military considerations rather than any fundamental change in Murena's ultimate objectives, as he continued to view the conflict as an opportunity for personal advancement rather than a serious challenge to Roman regional interests. The diplomatic initiatives that both sides pursued during the autumn of 83 BC demonstrated their mutual recognition that the current level of conflict served neither party's fundamental interests while creating risks of uncontrolled escalation that could prove catastrophic for both kingdoms. Mithridates dispatched envoys to Rome seeking Senate intervention to halt Murena's unauthorized operations, while simultaneously maintaining communication with the governor himself to explore possibilities for negotiated settlement that would allow both sides to claim success. These parallel diplomatic efforts reflected the king's sophisticated understanding of Roman political dynamics and his recognition that different Roman officials might respond to different types of appeals. The Roman Senate's reaction to reports of renewed fighting in Asia Minor reflected the complex domestic political situation that had developed following Sulla's return from the East and his subsequent constitutional reforms. Conservative senators who supported Sulla's authority were reluctant to criticize a subordinate commander whose actions might be interpreted as defending Roman interests, while those opposed to the dictator's regime saw opportunities to embarrass the government by highlighting the unauthorized nature of Murena's operations. The resulting political paralysis prevented any clear directive from reaching Asia Minor, leaving both Murena and Mithridates uncertain about Rome's ultimate intentions regarding the conflict. Sulla's personal intervention in the crisis came only after reports reached Rome indicating that the fighting in Asia Minor was escalating beyond the limited border skirmishing that had initially characterized Murena's operations. The dictator's assessment of the situation emphasized the dangers of allowing unauthorized military adventures to develop into major conflicts that could undermine the broader strategic settlement he had negotiated with Mithridates. Sulla recognized that renewed full-scale war with Pontus would require substantial military resources that Rome could not afford to commit, while domestic political stability remained precarious and other frontier regions required continued attention. The diplomatic resolution that Sulla engineered reflected his pragmatic approach to both military and political challenges, as he sought to end the immediate crisis while preserving Roman prestige and maintaining the essential elements of the Dardanius settlement. Direct communications with Mithridates emphasized Rome's commitment to the existing treaty arrangements, while acknowledging that Murena's actions had exceeded his authority and did not represent official Roman policy. Simultaneously, orders were dispatched to Murena requiring him to cease offensive operations and withdraw Roman forces to their original positions along the Cappadocian border. The recall of Murena from his Asian command was implemented through administrative measures that avoided any formal acknowledgement that the governor had acted improperly, while ensuring that future operations would be conducted under closer supervision from Rome. Sulla appointed Lucius Licinius Lucullus as the new provincial governor, selecting an officer whose reputation for both military competence and political reliability would ensure that Roman interests were protected without creating opportunities for renewed unauthorized adventures. The transition of command was managed carefully to avoid any appearance of Roman weakness, while making clear that the previous aggressive policies had been discontinued. Mithridates' acceptance of the Roman diplomatic initiative demonstrated his continued preference for negotiated settlement over military confrontation when conditions allowed him to achieve his essential objectives without resort to large-scale warfare. The king's public statements emphasized his satisfaction with Rome's acknowledgement that the recent fighting had resulted from unauthorized actions rather than deliberate policy changes, while his private communications with Pontic military commanders made clear that the current peace represented a temporary pause in preparations for eventual renewed conflict, rather than any fundamental acceptance of Roman regional dominance. The territorial adjustments that concluded this brief conflict largely restored the status quo that had existed before Murena's initial attacks, with Pontic forces reoccupying their original border positions, while Roman garrisons withdrew to the boundaries established by the Dardanus Treaty. The limited nature of these changes reflected both the restricted scope of the fighting and the mutual recognition that neither side had achieved sufficient military success to justify major territorial demands. The brief war had served primarily to test the military improvements that both sides had implemented since the previous conflict, while demonstrating that the fundamental strategic balance in the region remained essentially unchanged. The financial costs of Murena's adventure fell primarily on the provincial administration of Asia, which was required to compensate communities that had suffered damage during the fighting, while also funding the military operations that had achieved no lasting strategic benefits. These expenditures created additional strain on provincial resources that were still recovering from the devastation of the previous war, while the arbitrary nature of the conflict generated resentment among local populations who found themselves bearing the costs of Roman military adventures that served no apparent purpose beyond advancing individual careers. The lessons that Roman military commanders drew from the Second Mithridatic War would influence their approach to future conflicts with Pontus, as the fighting had demonstrated both the continued effectiveness of traditional Roman tactical methods and the significant improvements that Mithridates had achieved in Pontic military organisation. The king's forces had proven capable of achieving tactical victories under favourable conditions while maintaining discipline and cohesion that matched Roman standards, suggesting that future conflicts would require more careful planning and larger resource commitments than previous Roman leaders had anticipated. The death of Nicomedes IV of Bithynia in the winter of 75 BC created the precise opportunity that Mithridates had been anticipating throughout the decade of uneasy peace that had followed Murena's abortive campaign. The Bithynian king's final testament, delivered to Roman authorities through his designated executors, bequeathed his entire kingdom to the Roman people in a gesture that contemporary sources described as both politically astute and personally vindictive. Nicomedes had never forgiven Mithridates for the humiliation of his earlier exile, and viewed the donation of his realm to Rome as the ultimate expression of his hatred for the Pontic monarch who had twice driven him from his throne. The legal and political implications of this bequest were immediately apparent to observers throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, as Roman acceptance would create a direct territorial border between Pontus and Roman provincial administration for the first time since the conclusion of the First Mithridatic War. The strategic significance of Bithynia extended far beyond its modest territorial extent, as the kingdom controlled crucial overland routes connecting Asia Minor with the Balkans, while its ports provided essential naval bases for any power seeking to dominate the Propontis and the approaches to the Black Sea. Roman control of these positions would effectively encircle Pontus and provide launching points for future military operations against Mithridates' core territories. The Roman Senate's deliberations regarding the Bithynian inheritance revealed deep divisions within the governing class about the wisdom of accepting territorial acquisitions that would inevitably provoke renewed conflict with Pontus. Conservative senators who had supported Sulla's earlier settlement argued that the existing treaty arrangements provided adequate security for Roman interests without the administrative burdens and military commitments that direct provincial governance would require. The costs of maintaining permanent garrisons in Bithynia, combined with the inevitable Pontic response to Roman expansion, would strain the Republic's resources while creating ongoing obligations that could not be easily abandoned if circumstances changed. The opposing faction, led by ambitious politicians who viewed Eastern expansion as an opportunity for personal enrichment and military glory, argued that Roman acceptance of the bequest represented both a legal obligation and a strategic necessity. Nicomedes had died as a loyal Roman ally whose final wishes deserved respect, while rejection of his gift would signal weakness to potential enemies throughout the region. The wealth of Bithynian cities and the kingdom's strategic position justified whatever military expenditures might be required to defend Roman control, particularly since Pontic aggression appeared inevitable regardless of Roman policy decisions. The Senate's ultimate decision to accept the Bithynian bequest was influenced by intelligence reports indicating that Mithridates was already implementing military preparations that suggested aggressive intentions regardless of Roman actions. Pontic agents had been active throughout Asia Minor during the previous months, establishing contact with anti-Roman factions while conducting detailed reconnaissance of Roman military dispositions and defensive arrangements. These activities, combined with reports of increased military recruitment within Pontus itself, convinced Roman leaders that war was approaching whether or not they accepted territorial expansion in Bithynia. Mithridates received confirmation of Roman intentions through his extensive intelligence network several weeks before official announcements were made in Rome, allowing him to accelerate the military preparations that had been developing systematically throughout the interwar period. The king's strategic planning for the anticipated Third War reflected lessons learned from previous conflicts, particularly the recognition that successful resistance to Roman power required coordinated operations across multiple theatres that would prevent the concentration of Roman resources against any single objective. The scope and complexity of these preparations demonstrated the sophistication of Pontic military organisation and the extent of the alliance networks that Mithridates had constructed during the years of apparent peace. The cornerstone of Mithridates' strategic vision was a formal military alliance with Tigranes II of Armenia, whose expanding kingdom had emerged as the dominant power in the eastern Anatolian highlands during the previous decade. Tigranes commanded substantial military resources, including the renowned Armenian heavy cavalry that had proven decisive in numerous campaigns against Parthian and Seleucid forces. while his territorial acquisitions in Syria and Mesopotamia provided strategic depth and additional sources of military recruitment. The alliance agreement, negotiated through secret diplomatic channels over several months, established coordinated operational plans that would force Rome to conduct simultaneous campaigns across vast distances while facing enemies who could support each other through shared intelligence and mutual military assistance. The Armenian king's motivations for entering this alliance reflected his own territorial ambitions and his recognition that Roman expansion in Asia Minor would inevitably threaten Armenian interests in the region. Tigranes had established his capital at Tigranocerta, a magnificent new city whose construction demonstrated both his wealth and his determination to create a lasting imperial legacy that would rival the greatest achievements of his predecessors. Roman control of Bithynia and the inevitable expansion of Roman influence throughout Anatolia would constrain Armenian access to Mediterranean trade routes, while potentially encouraging Roman intervention in territories that Tigranes considered within his legitimate sphere of influence. The military capabilities that Armenia could contribute to the anti-Roman alliance were substantial and complemented Pontic strengths in ways that created formidable combined operational potential. Armenian forces excelled in the type of mobile warfare that had proven most effective against Roman tactical formations, while their experience in siege operations and mountain warfare provided capabilities that Pontic armies had traditionally lacked. The integration of Armenian and Pontic military units required careful coordination and extensive joint training exercises, but the resulting combined forces possessed both the numerical strength and tactical diversity necessary to challenge Roman military supremacy under favourable conditions. Simultaneously, Mithridates pursued alliance negotiations with Quintus Sertorius, the Roman general whose independent state in Spain represented both a potential source of military expertise and a strategic diversion that would prevent Rome from concentrating all available resources against eastern opponents. The diplomatic contacts that had been established during the previous interwar period had evolved into substantive military cooperation agreements that provided Mithridates with access to Roman tactical knowledge and advanced military technologies while offering Sertorius potential support for his own operations against the Roman government. The geographical separation between Spain and Asia Minor complicated direct military coordination, but both leaders recognized that simultaneous pressure on opposite frontiers would strain Roman strategic capabilities beyond their effective limits. The alliance with Mediterranean pirates represented perhaps the most innovative element of Mithridates' strategic planning, as these maritime forces controlled sea routes throughout the eastern Mediterranean while possessing the naval capabilities necessary to disrupt Roman communications and supply lines. Piratical organisations had expanded dramatically during the previous decades, taking advantage of the power vacuum created by the decline of traditional naval powers and the Roman Republic's focus on land-based military operations. Their fleets, operating from secure bases throughout the Aegean Islands and the southern Anatolian coast, had achieved effective control over commercial shipping while developing the organisational structures and tactical capabilities that made them formidable naval opponents. The coordination of these diverse alliance partners required sophisticated diplomatic and military planning that demonstrated Mithridates' evolution from a regional strongman into a strategic leader capable of organising resistance to Roman power on an unprecedented scale. Secret communications networks linked Pontic headquarters with allied courts throughout the Mediterranean world, while carefully coordinated timing ensured that military operations would commence simultaneously across multiple theatres before Roman commanders could implement effective countermeasures. The complexity of these arrangements reflected both the king's personal growth as a strategic planner and the administrative capabilities that Pontus had developed during the years of apparent peace. The financial resources necessary to support these extensive military preparations were generated through systematic exploitation of Pontic territorial acquisitions in the Black Sea region, where control of trade routes and natural resources provided substantial revenue streams that could be directed toward military expenditures. The Crimean Bosporus continued to generate enormous profits from grain exports, while Colchian gold mines provided the precious metals necessary to purchase weapons, hire mercenaries, and subsidize Allied operations throughout the Mediterranean world. These economic foundations allowed Mithridates to sustain military preparations on a scale that would have been impossible for smaller kingdoms, while maintaining the secrecy necessary to achieve a strategic surprise when operations commenced. The military reforms that Mithridates implemented during this preparatory period addressed the tactical weaknesses that had been revealed during previous conflicts with Roman forces. Traditional Pontic military organisation, based on Hellenistic models that emphasised individual unit capabilities rather than coordinated operations, was gradually replaced with integrated command structures that could coordinate complex multi-unit manoeuvres under battlefield conditions. Training programs introduced Roman disciplinary methods and tactical doctrines, while maintaining the cultural elements that provided Pontic forces with their distinctive identity and motivation. The weapons and equipment that Pontic workshops produced during this period reflected systematic study of captured Roman materials, combined with innovations derived from Allied military traditions. Standardized armor and weapons were manufactured according to specifications that matched or exceeded Roman quality standards, while specialized equipment was developed for specific tactical applications, including siege operations, naval warfare, and the type of mobile operations that would be necessary to exploit Pontic advantages in terrain and strategic mobility. These manufacturing efforts required substantial investment in both facilities and skilled craftsmen, but they created military capabilities that would prove decisive in the opening phases of the coming conflict. The intelligence networks that Mithridates had maintained throughout Roman territories provided detailed information about military dispositions, political developments, and economic conditions that allowed Pontic planners to identify optimal timing and targeting for their offensive operations. Agents operating under commercial or diplomatic cover had established contacts within Greek communities throughout Asia Minor, while others maintained surveillance of Roman military installations and administrative centres. The information gathered through these networks revealed both Roman strengths and vulnerabilities, while providing the operational intelligence necessary to coordinate complex multi-theatre campaigns. The recruitment of military forces for the anticipated conflict proceeded through multiple channels that reflected both Pontic territorial diversity and the international scope of the alliance networks that Mithridates had constructed. Traditional Pontic levies provided the core of infantry formations, while specialised units were recruited from throughout the Black Sea region based on their particular military capabilities and cultural traditions. Scythian and Sarmatian cavalry brought their renowned mobility and archery skills, while Greek cities contributed naval forces and siege specialists whose technical expertise complemented the raw military power provided by tribal contingents. The training and organisation of these diverse forces required careful attention to both military effectiveness and political reliability, as the multi-ethnic composition of Pontic armies created both tactical opportunities and potential sources of internal conflict. Mithridates addressed these challenges through a combination of integrated command structures that promoted cooperation between different ethnic groups and incentive systems that rewarded loyalty and battlefield performance regardless of cultural background. The resulting military forces possessed both the tactical diversity necessary to exploit different operational environments and the unit cohesion required for sustained combat against disciplined Roman opponents. The diplomatic offensive that accompanied these military preparations was designed to maximise anti-Roman sentiment throughout the eastern Mediterranean, while creating conditions that would support Pontic operations when hostilities commenced. Embassies were dispatched to courts throughout the region, offering favourable alliance terms to rulers who shared interests in limiting Roman expansion, while propaganda campaigns emphasised Mithridates' role as the defender of traditional Eastern values against Roman cultural imperialism. These efforts achieved considerable success in creating a regional coalition that viewed Pontic leadership as preferable to continued Roman domination. The timing of Mithridates' offensive was carefully coordinated to exploit seasonal factors and Roman political developments that would maximise the chances of achieving strategic surprise while minimising the effectiveness of Roman defensive responses. The king's intelligence indicated that Roman military forces in Asia Minor remained limited in both numbers and quality, while domestic political conflicts within the Republic continued to divert attention and resources from Eastern affairs. The combination of favourable strategic conditions and completed military preparations created an opportunity that Mithridates recognised might not recur if Roman leaders became aware of the scope of Pontic preparations and implemented appropriate countermeasures. The invasion of Bithynia commenced in the spring of 74 BC with coordinated assaults that demonstrated both the scale of Pontic military capabilities and the effectiveness of the strategic planning that had characterised the interwar period. Rather than the single-axis advance that had characterised previous Pontic operations, Mithridates implemented a multi-pronged offensive that attacked Roman positions from several directions simultaneously while preventing effective concentration of defensive forces. The main Pontic army, numbering approximately 150,000 infantry and 16,000 cavalry, advanced directly from Pontus toward the Bithynian capital at Nicomedia, while secondary forces moved through Paphlagonia and along the coastal routes to secure key strategic positions before Roman reinforcements could arrive. The speed of Pontic success in the opening phases of the campaign reflected both superior numbers and better intelligence about Roman defensive arrangements. Bithynian cities that had reluctantly accepted Roman administration welcomed Pontic forces as liberators, while Roman garrisons found themselves isolated and outnumbered by hostile local populations that had been prepared for uprising through months of careful political preparation. The collapse of Roman border defences occurred within days of the initial assault, as positions that had been designed to delay rather than halt enemy advances were overwhelmed by coordinated attacks that exploited their tactical weaknesses. The siege of Chalcedon demonstrated the improvements in Pontic siege capabilities that had been achieved through systematic study of Roman engineering techniques combined with innovations derived from Armenian and other allied military traditions. The city's fortifications, strengthened during the previous years of Roman occupation, presented formidable obstacles that would have required extended siege operations using traditional Hellenistic methods. Instead, Pontic engineers implemented coordinated assault techniques that combined traditional siege engines with innovative approaches to undermining defensive walls and disrupting garrison communications. The city fell within 2 weeks of the initial investment, providing Pontic forces with a crucial strategic position that controlled access to the Propontis, while demonstrating their enhanced technical capabilities to potential allies and enemies throughout the region. The Roman military response to these initial Pontic successes revealed both the Republic's continued capacity for rapid mobilization and the strategic challenges posed by fighting a multi-theatre war against a revitalized enemy coalition. The Senate's decision to appoint Lucius Licinius Lucullus and Marcus Aurelius Cotta as joint commanders reflected recognition that the Eastern crisis required both substantial military resources and experienced leadership capable of coordinating complex operations across vast distances. Lucullus brought proven administrative capabilities and extensive knowledge of Eastern affairs derived from his previous service under Sulla, while Cotta possessed the naval expertise necessary to challenge Pontic control of maritime communications throughout the region. The appointment of Lucullus and Cotta to joint command of Roman forces in the east represented a calculated response to the unprecedented scale of the Mithridatic threat, yet the division of authority would soon prove problematic as the two commanders pursued divergent strategic approaches that prevented effective coordination of Roman military efforts. Lucullus, assigned primary responsibility for land operations, brought to his command a methodical approach to warfare that emphasized careful preparation, superior logistics, and the systematic reduction of enemy capabilities through sustained pressure rather than decisive battles. His previous experience as Sulla's quaestor during the First Mithridatic War had provided him with detailed knowledge of Pontic military organisation and strategic capabilities, while his subsequent administrative service in Asia had familiarised him with the regional political dynamics that would prove crucial to successful operations. Cotta's naval command encompassed responsibility for securing Roman communications across the Aegean, while preventing Pontic forces from establishing permanent control over the sea routes that connected Asia Minor with the broader Mediterranean world. His fleet, assembled from squadrons based at various Roman naval stations throughout the region, numbered approximately 80 warships of various classes, supported by numerous transport vessels and auxiliary craft. The strategic importance of maintaining naval superiority had been demonstrated during the previous war, when Pontic control of maritime communications had enabled Mithridates to coordinate operations across vast distances, while Roman forces remained constrained by their dependence on overland supply routes. The initial Roman strategic assessment revealed the magnitude of the challenge facing the Republic's eastern commanders, as Mithridates had succeeded in creating a coordinated alliance network that could threaten Roman interests across multiple theatres simultaneously. Intelligence reports indicated that Pontic forces in Bithynia numbered at least 150,000 infantry and 16,000 cavalry, while Armenian armies under Tigranes commanded additional substantial forces that could potentially intervene in the Anatolian theatre. The Mediterranean pirate fleets allied with Pontus controlled numerous strategic islands and coastal bases, enabling them to disrupt Roman shipping while providing secure communications between the various elements of the anti-Roman coalition. Lucullus recognised that traditional Roman tactical superiority would prove insufficient against an enemy who had learned from previous defeats and implemented comprehensive military reforms designed to neutralise Roman advantages. The Pontic forces that had invaded Bithynia displayed discipline and organisational capabilities that approached Roman standards, while their equipment and weapons reflected systematic improvements that eliminated many of the technical disparities that had characterised earlier conflicts. More significantly, Mithridates had demonstrated strategic vision that extended far beyond the tactical considerations that had dominated previous Eastern wars, creating conditions that would require sustained Roman commitment across multiple campaigns to achieve decisive results. The methodical approach that Lucullus implemented during the opening phases of his campaign reflected both his personal strategic philosophy and his realistic assessment of Roman capabilities relative to the challenges they faced. Rather than attempting immediate relief of besieged Roman positions through hasty advances that might expose his forces to defeat in detail, the Roman commander established secure bases in western Anatolia, while systematically gathering intelligence about enemy dispositions and capabilities. This deliberate pace frustrated subordinate commanders who favoured more aggressive action, but it allowed Lucullus to build the logistical foundations necessary for sustained operations, while avoiding the kind of premature commitments that had characterised previous Roman failures in the region. The siege of Cyzicus, which began in late 74 BC, would provide the first major test of both Pontic military improvements and Roman adaptive capabilities under the new strategic conditions. Mithridates had concentrated approximately 300,000 troops around this crucial Greek city, whose strategic position on the Propontis made it essential for controlling communications between Asia Minor and the European territories that might provide reinforcements to Roman forces. The king's decision to commit such massive resources to this single objective reflected his understanding that capture of Cyzicus would effectively isolate Roman forces in Asia Minor, while providing a secure base for subsequent operations against Roman positions throughout the region. The fortifications surrounding Cyzicus had been strengthened extensively during the previous years of Roman occupation, incorporating both traditional Greek defensive features and Roman engineering innovations that created formidable obstacles to conventional siege techniques. The city's position on a peninsula, connected to the mainland by a narrow isthmus, provided natural defensive advantages that limited the directions from which attackers could approach, while its harbour facilities allowed continued communication with potential relief forces, as long as Pontic naval forces could be prevented from establishing complete blockade. The civilian population, numbering approximately 50,000, included substantial numbers of Roman citizens and Italian merchants, whose presence ensured that the city's defenders would fight with determination born of desperation. Mithridates' siege methodology demonstrated the sophisticated military engineering capabilities that Pontic forces had developed through systematic study of Roman techniques, combined with innovations derived from Armenian and other allied military traditions. Rather than relying solely on direct assault against the city's walls, Pontic engineers implemented a comprehensive investment that included elaborate circumvallation works designed to prevent any possibility of relief, while maintaining secure communications with Pontic supply bases in the interior. These fortifications, constructed according to Roman engineering principles, but incorporating defensive innovations that reflected lessons learned from previous siege operations, created a double ring of obstacles that protected the besieging forces while ensuring that the siege could be maintained indefinitely. The scale of the Pontic siege works around Cyzicus rivaled the most ambitious Roman engineering projects, requiring the coordinated labour of tens of thousands of workers over several months to complete. The outer ring of fortifications extended for nearly 20 miles, incorporating natural terrain features while creating artificial obstacles that would prevent any relief force from approaching the city without first reducing the Pontic siege lines. The inner works, designed to contain the besieged population while protecting Pontic forces from sorties, included elaborate systems of trenches, palisades, and artillery positions that could deliver concentrated firepower against any section of the city's walls. Lucullus's response to the siege of Cyzicus revealed the innovative tactical thinking that would characterize his eastern campaigns, as he recognized that direct assault on the Pontic siege lines would likely result in catastrophic Roman casualties without achieving decisive results. Instead, the Roman commander implemented a strategy that combined naval operations with coordinated attacks on Pontic supply lines designed to force Mithridates to abandon the siege through logistical pressure rather than military defeat. This approach required careful coordination between land and naval forces, while maintaining sufficient flexibility to exploit opportunities as they developed during the extended campaign. The naval blockade that Cotta established around the Propontis represented the first successful Roman challenge to Pontic maritime supremacy since the beginning of the current war. Roman squadrons, operating from bases in the Aegean Islands and the western Anatolian coast, implemented coordinated patrol patterns that interdicted Pontic supply ships while protecting their own communications with reinforcement bases in Greece and Italy. The effectiveness of this blockade was enhanced by intelligence provided by Greek cities that had remained loyal to Rome, whose merchant networks provided detailed information about Pontic shipping movements and naval dispositions. The gradual tightening of Roman naval control around the Pontic siege lines created increasing logistical difficulties for Mithridates' massive army, as the king's supply requirements exceeded the capacity of overland transportation routes to maintain adequate provisions for his forces. The Pontic army's size, which had initially appeared to guarantee rapid success through overwhelming numerical superiority, became a strategic liability as Roman naval pressure reduced available supplies while winter weather complicated overland transportation from Pontic territory. These logistical constraints forced Mithridates to consider either reducing his forces through demobilization or abandoning the siege before achieving his strategic objectives. Lucullus exploited these developing Pontic vulnerabilities through carefully coordinated attacks on enemy supply convoys and communication lines that further strained Mithridates' logistical capabilities while avoiding direct engagement with the main Pontic army. Roman cavalry units, supported by local auxiliaries who possessed intimate knowledge of regional terrain, conducted systematic raids against Pontic supply trains while maintaining sufficient mobility to avoid retaliation by superior enemy forces. These operations, conducted across hundreds of miles of Anatolian territory, required sophisticated coordination and intelligence gathering, but achieved cumulative effects that gradually undermined Pontic operational capabilities. The psychological impact of these sustained Roman operations began manifesting itself in declining morale among Pontic forces as the siege of Cyzicus extended into the winter months without achieving decisive progress. The multinational composition of Mithridates' army, which had initially provided tactical advantages through diverse military capabilities, became a source of internal tension as different ethnic groups blamed each other for the campaign's disappointing results. Scythian cavalry units, accustomed to mobile warfare, grew restless during the static siege operations, while Greek contingents questioned the strategic wisdom of maintaining such massive forces in a single location where they could be systematically attrited by Roman naval and cavalry operations. The breakthrough in Roman operations came during the spring of 73 BC, when coordinated naval and land attacks succeeded in severing the primary Pontic supply routes, while simultaneously threatening the siege army's lines of retreat toward Pontus proper. Lucullus had spent months positioning his forces for this decisive operation, establishing forward bases that could support sustained attacks while maintaining secure communications with his main supply sources. The timing of the assault exploited seasonal factors that favoured Roman naval operations, while taking advantage of intelligence indicating that Pontic forces had become dispersed across their extended siege lines. The collapse of the Pontic position around Cyzicus occurred with shocking rapidity once Roman forces achieved their initial breakthrough, as Mithridates discovered that his elaborate siege works had become a trap that prevented effective withdrawal of his massive army. The king's attempts to organise fighting retreats were frustrated by the logistical chaos that resulted from the sudden abandonment of supply depots and siege equipment, while Roman pursuit operations inflicted devastating casualties on Pontic units that had lost their organisational cohesion. Contemporary sources describe the retreat as one of the most complete military disasters in ancient warfare, with Pontic losses exceeding 200,000 casualties from all causes including combat, disease, and desertion. The strategic implications of the Cyzicus campaign extended far beyond its immediate tactical results, as the destruction of Mithridates' primary field army eliminated the offensive capabilities that had enabled Pontic expansion, while demonstrating to potential allies throughout the region that Roman military power remained formidable despite initial setbacks. The king's retreat to Pontus proper was accompanied by widespread defections among Greek cities and client kingdoms that had supported his cause, as local leaders recognized that continued resistance to Rome would likely result in the same catastrophic punishment that had befallen Pontic forces. The psychological impact of Roman success encouraged pro-Roman factions throughout Asia Minor, while discouraging further rebellions against Roman authority. Lucullus's exploitation of his victory at Cyzicus demonstrated the systematic approach to warfare that would characterize his subsequent campaigns, as he recognized that military success required consolidation through political and administrative measures that would prevent enemy recovery. Rather than immediately pursuing Mithridates into Pontic territory, the Roman commander implemented a comprehensive program designed to restore Roman authority throughout the recovered territories while building the logistical foundations necessary for sustained operations against the enemy's core strongholds. This methodical approach frustrated subordinates who favoured immediate pursuit, but it created conditions that would enable eventual decisive victory through systematic pressure rather than risky direct assault. The restoration of Roman naval supremacy in the eastern Aegean followed naturally from the success at Cyzicus, as Pontic naval forces found themselves unable to maintain their advanced positions without support from land-based armies. Cotta's squadrons systematically reduced Pontic naval bases throughout the region, while establishing Roman control over the sea routes that connected Asia Minor with potential sources of reinforcement and supply. The elimination of Pontic naval capabilities forced Mithridates to rely entirely on overland communications that were vulnerable to Roman interdiction, while preventing any possibility of coordinated operations with allied forces in other theatres. The systematic conquest of Pontus proper began in earnest during 72 BC as Lucullus advanced methodically through the kingdom's border regions, while implementing siege operations against the fortified cities that controlled key strategic positions. The Roman approach emphasized careful preparation and overwhelming local superiority rather than rapid advances that might expose Roman forces to counterattack by enemy forces operating on familiar terrain. This strategy required substantial time and resources, but minimized Roman casualties while ensuring that conquered territories would remain under secure Roman control rather than reverting to enemy control once Roman forces advanced toward new objectives. The siege of Sinope, Pontus's principal port city and administrative centre, demonstrated the sophisticated siege techniques that Roman engineers had developed through systematic study of Eastern fortification methods combined with innovations derived from their own military traditions. The city's massive walls, constructed according to Hellenistic engineering principles and strengthened during previous decades of Pontic expansion, presented formidable obstacles that required coordinated assault techniques, employing both traditional siege engines and innovative approaches to undermining defensive structures. The operation required 8 months of sustained effort but resulted in the capture of one of the most important strategic positions in the Black Sea region. The fall of Sinope was accompanied by systematic destruction of Pontic naval facilities and commercial infrastructure that eliminated the kingdom's capacity for maritime operations while providing Roman forces with secure bases for future operations throughout the Black Sea region. Lucullus's treatment of the captured city reflected his understanding that excessive brutality might encourage desperate resistance in other Pontic strongholds, as he permitted the civilian population to retain their property and personal freedom while requiring only political submission to Roman authority. This moderate approach encouraged surrenders at other Pontic cities while demonstrating that Roman victory would not necessarily result in the kind of systematic destruction that had characterized previous Eastern wars. The capture of Amisus required different tactical approaches, as the city's position on a heavily fortified promontory made direct assault extremely costly, while its continued access to the sea allowed the garrison to receive supplies and reinforcements from remaining Pontic territories. Lucullus implemented an innovative combination of naval blockade and land-based siege operations that gradually isolated the city while preventing effective relief efforts by enemy forces. The siege required nearly a year to complete, but resulted in the elimination of Pontus's last major naval base, while providing Roman forces with complete control over the southern shore of the Black Sea. Mithridates' strategic retreat to Armenia during 70 BC represented a calculated decision to preserve his remaining military capabilities, while seeking alliance support that might enable eventual recovery of his lost territories. The king's analysis of his strategic position recognized that continued resistance within Pontus proper would likely result in the complete destruction of his remaining forces without achieving meaningful military results, while withdrawal to Armenian territory would provide secure bases for reorganization, while potentially drawing Roman forces into unfavorable strategic positions. This decision required abandoning most of his ancestral territories but preserved the possibility of future restoration under more favorable circumstances. The alliance between Mithridates and Tigranes II had evolved substantially since its initial formation, as the Armenian king had expanded his territorial control throughout Syria and Mesopotamia, while building military capabilities that rivaled those of any contemporary power. Tigranes commanded approximately 100,000 infantry and 55,000 cavalry according to contemporary estimates, while his control of wealthy commercial centres provided financial resources that could support sustained military operations against Roman forces. The integration of Pontic and Armenian military capabilities created combined forces that possessed both numerical superiority and tactical diversity sufficient to challenge Roman military supremacy under favourable conditions. Lucullus's decision to pursue the war into Armenia during 69 BC represented one of the most controversial strategic choices of his entire command, as it extended Roman military commitments far beyond the original objectives that had motivated the war, while creating logistical challenges that would strain Roman capabilities to their limits. The Roman commander's strategic assessment emphasized the necessity of eliminating Mithridates completely rather than allowing him to recover in Armenian exile, but critics argued that the risks of operating in unfamiliar territory against a powerful enemy coalition exceeded any potential benefits that might be achieved through successful operations. The Senate's initial reluctance to authorize such extensive operations reflected broader concerns about the costs and risks of unlimited eastern expansion. The logistical preparations necessary for Roman operations in Armenia required unprecedented coordination between military and civilian authorities throughout the eastern Mediterranean, as the distances involved exceeded anything previously attempted by Roman forces, while the terrain presented formidable obstacles to traditional supply methods. Lucullus established a complex network of supply depots and communication stations that extended from the Aegean coast through central Anatolia to the Armenian frontier, while simultaneously organising local recruitment and supply arrangements that would reduce dependence on distant Roman bases. These preparations required months of intensive effort but created the logistical foundations necessary for sustained operations in hostile territory. The march into Armenia demonstrated both the capabilities and limitations of Roman military organisation when operating at the extreme limits of their strategic reach. Lucullus commanded approximately 30,000 legionary infantry supported by substantial auxiliary forces and specialised units recruited from throughout the eastern Mediterranean, while his baggage train included the siege equipment and engineering capabilities necessary for operations against fortified positions. The army's progress through the difficult mountain terrain that separated Pontus from Armenia required careful coordination and substantial local support, as traditional Roman logistical methods proved inadequate for the challenges presented by extended operations in unfamiliar territory. The Battle of Tigranocerta, fought in the autumn of 69 BC, would demonstrate both the continued effectiveness of Roman tactical methods and the strategic limitations that prevented decisive victory despite overwhelming tactical success. Tigranes had concentrated approximately 150,000 troops in defensive positions around his capital city, confident that numerical superiority and favourable terrain would enable Armenian forces to achieve the kind of decisive victory that had eluded Mithridates during his previous confrontations with Roman armies. The Armenian king's tactical deployment emphasised the mobile cavalry forces that had proven most effective in previous campaigns, while positioning his infantry reserves in strong defensive positions that could support counterattacks against Roman formations that became overextended during their assault. Lucullus's tactical approach to the Tigranocerta engagement reflected his systematic analysis of Armenian military capabilities, combined with innovations designed to exploit specific weaknesses in enemy deployments. Rather than attempting direct assault against the Armenian defensive positions, Roman forces implemented coordinated maneuvers that drew enemy cavalry into unfavourable engagements while maintaining sufficient cohesion to resist counterattacks by Armenian infantry reserves. The battle's outcome demonstrated that Roman tactical superiority remained decisive under favourable conditions, as Armenian forces suffered catastrophic casualties, while Roman losses remained minimal despite the numerical disparity between the opposing armies. The capture of Tigranocerta provided Roman forces with enormous quantities of treasure and military supplies, while demonstrating to potential allies throughout the region that even the most powerful eastern kingdoms could not successfully resist Roman military capabilities. The city's wealth, accumulated through decades of Armenian expansion and commercial success, enabled Lucullus to address some of the financial pressures that had been mounting throughout the extended campaign, while providing resources for continued operations against remaining enemy strongholds. The psychological impact of the victory encouraged defections among Armenian allies while discouraging potential supporters of continued resistance to Roman authority. The strategic implications of Lucullus's victory at Tigranocerta created a paradox that would ultimately undermine his entire Eastern command, as tactical success generated political complications that proved more challenging than the military obstacles he had systematically overcome. The destruction of Tigranes' primary field army and the capture of his magnificent capital demonstrated Roman military supremacy throughout the region, yet these achievements extended Roman commitments far beyond what the Senate had originally authorized, while creating administrative burdens that exceeded available resources. The wealth captured at Tigranocerta, while substantial, proved insufficient to fund the ongoing military operations necessary to consolidate Roman control over such vast territories, while the distances involved made effective communication with Rome increasingly difficult. The political crisis that emerged in Rome during Lucullus's absence would prove decisive in determining the ultimate outcome of the Eastern War, as domestic opponents of his command exploited public frustration with the extended campaign's costs and limited territorial gains. The tribune Gaius Manilius, supported by powerful financial interests who had been excluded from the profitable aspects of Eastern administration, began organising legislative challenges to Lucullus's continued authority while promoting alternative commanders who promised more rapid and profitable resolution of the Eastern crisis. These domestic political manoeuvres reflected broader tensions within Roman society about the proper scope of imperial expansion and the distribution of benefits derived from successful military campaigns. Mithridates utilised this period of Roman political uncertainty to implement a remarkable strategic recovery that demonstrated both his personal resilience and the sophisticated understanding of Roman weaknesses that he developed through decades of conflict. Rather than accepting permanent exile in Armenia, the king began organising a new military coalition that would exploit Roman overextension while capitalising on the war weariness that had developed among populations throughout Asia Minor. His agents renewed contact with anti-Roman factions in Greek cities while establishing communication with barbarian tribes along Rome's northern frontiers who might provide diversionary pressures that would force Roman commanders to divide their attention between multiple theatres. The recruitment of new military forces proceeded through channels that had been established during previous interwar periods, as Mithridates' reputation for successful resistance to Roman power attracted volunteers from throughout the eastern Mediterranean world. Gallic mercenaries, veterans of conflicts in Western Europe who possessed both combat experience and knowledge of Roman tactical methods, provided professional military expertise that complemented the traditional Pontic forces recruited from tribal populations around the Black Sea. These diverse military elements required extensive training and organisational development to create effective combined forces, but they offered tactical capabilities that could potentially exploit Roman vulnerabilities that had been revealed during the extended Armenian campaign. The financial resources necessary to support this military revival came primarily from the Crimean territories that remained under Pontic control, where grain exports and commercial activities continued to generate substantial revenue despite the ongoing conflict. Mithridates had invested heavily in developing these northern territories during previous decades, creating economic foundations that could sustain prolonged resistance even after the loss of his core Anatolian territories. The king's systematic exploitation of these resources demonstrated the sophisticated economic planning that had characterized his entire reign, while providing the material basis for continued military operations against Roman positions. Lucullus's strategic position during 68 BC reflected the fundamental challenges that faced any Roman commander operating at such extended distances from secure supply bases while confronting enemies who possessed both local advantages and strategic mobility. His forces, while victorious in every major engagement, had been reduced through casualties, disease, and the necessity of maintaining garrisons throughout captured territories to approximately 20,000 effective combat troops supported by various auxiliary units of questionable reliability. These numbers, while adequate for defensive operations, were insufficient for the kind of aggressive campaigning that would be necessary to eliminate remaining enemy strongholds while preventing Mithridates from reorganizing effective resistance. The logistical situation had deteriorated substantially as Roman supply lines extended across hundreds of miles of hostile territory where local populations remained sympathetic to enemy forces despite Roman military success. Traditional Roman methods of living off the land proved inadequate in regions where agricultural production had been disrupted by years of warfare, while the systematic destruction of enemy resources had eliminated many of the local supply sources that might otherwise have supported Roman operations. These constraints forced Lucullus to reduce the scope of his operations while concentrating available resources on maintaining secure positions rather than pursuing additional territorial gains. The mutinous sentiments that began developing among Roman troops during this period reflected both the practical hardships of extended campaigning in hostile territory and the growing recognition that the war's objectives had expanded far beyond what soldiers had originally anticipated when enlisting for Eastern service. Veterans who had served throughout the campaign expressed increasing frustration with the indefinite extension of their military obligations, particularly since many had fulfilled their original enlistment terms and expected discharge with appropriate rewards for their service. The absence of clear victory conditions or timeline for completion of operations created uncertainty that undermined military discipline, while encouraging the kind of individual grievances that could develop into collective resistance to continued campaigning. The emergence of Pompey as a potential alternative commander represented the convergence of multiple political and military factors that would fundamentally alter the strategic situation in the Eastern Mediterranean. Pompey's recent success in eliminating the Mediterranean pirate networks had demonstrated both his military capabilities and his capacity for achieving rapid, decisive results that satisfied public expectations, while generating substantial financial returns for Roman investors. His political connections with influential financial interests provided him with the resources necessary to organise effective challenges to Lucullus's continued authority, while his reputation for successful command made him an attractive alternative for senators who had grown frustrated with the extended Eastern campaign's costs and limited progress. The Lex Manilia, proposed during 66 BC, would transfer supreme command of all Eastern operations to Pompey, while providing him with unprecedented authority and resources to achieve final resolution of the Mithridatic threat. The legislation's supporters argued that the crisis required a commander with both proven military capabilities and sufficient political authority to coordinate operations across multiple theatres, while implementing the diplomatic initiatives necessary to isolate remaining enemy forces. Lucullus's methodical approach, while militarily successful, had failed to achieve the kind of rapid, comprehensive victory that Roman public opinion demanded, while his extended absence from Rome had weakened his political position relative to rivals who had remained active in domestic affairs. The political manoeuvring that surrounded the passage of the Lex Manilia revealed the extent to which Eastern affairs had become entangled with domestic Roman political competition, as various factions sought to exploit military appointments for their own advantage rather than focusing primarily on strategic considerations. Cicero's support for the legislation reflected his recognition that Pompey represented the most effective available solution to the Eastern crisis, while also serving his own political interests by aligning himself with a commander whose success would enhance the careers of his supporters. The opposition that emerged from conservative senators reflected both principled concerns about constitutional precedents and practical worries about concentrating such extensive authority in the hands of a single individual. Mithridates received intelligence about these Roman political developments through his extensive network of agents and diplomatic contacts throughout the Mediterranean world, allowing him to adjust his strategic planning to exploit the transition period that would inevitably accompany any change in Roman command structure. The king recognised that Pompey's appointment would bring both enhanced Roman capabilities and potential opportunities, as the new commander would require time to familiarise himself with local conditions while implementing whatever strategic changes he deemed necessary. This transition period might provide opportunities for offensive operations that could achieve significant gains before Roman forces could adapt to new leadership and tactical approaches. The coordination between Mithridates and his remaining allies required careful management of both military and diplomatic relationships that had been strained by years of unsuccessful resistance to Roman expansion. Tigranes, despite his defeat at Tigranocerta, retained substantial military capabilities and territorial control that could potentially support renewed operations against Roman positions, but the Armenian king's enthusiasm for continued conflict had been significantly reduced by his recent experiences with Roman military effectiveness. The maintenance of this crucial alliance required diplomatic concessions and strategic adjustments that acknowledged Armenian concerns while preserving the essential cooperation necessary for effective combined operations. The tribal confederations along the Caucasus frontier represented another potential source of military support that Mithridates had cultivated through decades of diplomatic and commercial relationships. These groups possessed both the mobility necessary for effective guerrilla operations against Roman supply lines and the local knowledge required to exploit terrain advantages that could neutralize Roman tactical superiority. Their integration into Pontic military planning required careful attention to cultural sensitivities and traditional tribal rivalries, but their participation could provide the kind of strategic diversions that might force Roman commanders to disperse their limited forces across multiple operational areas. The naval capabilities that remained available to Mithridates had been substantially reduced through Roman operations under Lucullus and Cotta, but significant resources survived in the form of pirate alliances and merchant vessels that could be converted for military purposes when circumstances required. The king's control of Black Sea ports provided secure bases for these naval forces, while his diplomatic relationships with various island communities offered potential staging areas for operations against Roman shipping and coastal installations. These maritime assets, while insufficient for major fleet engagements, could conduct the kind of commerce raiding and communication disruption that would complicate Roman logistics while providing Pontic forces with strategic mobility. The intelligence-gathering capabilities that Mithridates had developed throughout his reign provided crucial advantages in planning operations against Roman forces, whose movements and intentions could be monitored through networks of agents operating throughout Asia Minor and the broader Mediterranean region. Commercial travellers, religious pilgrims, and diplomatic envoys all contributed information about Roman military dispositions and political developments that allowed Pontic commanders to anticipate enemy actions while identifying opportunities for effective countermeasures. This intelligence network had survived the territorial losses of recent years and continued to provide the kind of strategic information that could prove decisive in future military operations. The propaganda efforts that accompanied Mithridates' strategic revival emphasized his role as the defender of Eastern traditions against Roman cultural imperialism, while promising restoration of the prosperity and autonomy that Greek cities had enjoyed before Roman occupation. These messages, disseminated through carefully cultivated networks of sympathetic intellectuals and religious leaders, sought to rebuild the popular support that had been crucial to Pontic success during the early phases of the conflict. The effectiveness of this propaganda campaign would depend largely on Mithridates' ability to demonstrate continued military viability through successful operations that proved Roman victory was neither inevitable nor permanent. The timing of renewed Pontic offensive operations required careful coordination with seasonal factors and Roman political developments to maximise the chances of achieving strategic surprise, while exploiting whatever advantages might be derived from the command transition that was occurring within Roman forces. Mithridates recognised that Pompey's appointment, while ultimately strengthening Roman capabilities, would create temporary vulnerabilities during the period when new command arrangements were being implemented and strategic priorities were being reassessed. The king's military preparations focused on achieving maximum readiness for operations that would need to commence before Roman forces could complete their reorganisation under new leadership. The strategic objectives that Mithridates established for this renewed phase of the conflict reflected both realistic assessments of Pontic capabilities and recognition that complete victory over Roman forces was no longer achievable through conventional military means. Instead, the king focused on creating conditions that would force Rome to accept negotiated settlement on terms that preserved Pontic independence, while acknowledging Roman regional supremacy. This approach required achieving sufficient military success to demonstrate continued Pontic viability, while avoiding the kind of decisive engagement that might result in complete destruction of remaining Pontic forces. The military innovations that Pontic forces had implemented during their period of strategic retreat included tactical adaptations designed to exploit Roman vulnerabilities that had been revealed during previous campaigns, while minimizing exposure to Roman strengths in conventional battlefield engagements. Emphasis was placed on mobility, surprise, and the kind of irregular operations that could achieve significant results without requiring the massive resource commitments that had characterized earlier Pontic military efforts. These tactical changes reflected lessons learned from years of conflict, while acknowledging the reduced circumstances that now constrained Pontic strategic options. The final phase of Mithridates' extraordinary life unfolded in the remote territories of the Crimean Bosporus, where the aging king had retreated after Pompey's systematic dismantling of his remaining strongholds in Pontus and Armenia. The Bosporan cities of Pantikapaeum and Chersonesos, which had served as crucial sources of revenue throughout his reign, now became his last refuge as Roman forces consolidated control over virtually all of his former territories. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers that the monarch who had once commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands and controlled territories spanning from the Black Sea to the Aegean now found himself confined to the windswept steppes and Greek trading posts of the Crimean Peninsula. Yet even in these reduced circumstances, Mithridates' strategic mind continued to function with the same audacious vision that had characterized his entire career. Intelligence reports reaching his headquarters at Pantikapaeum during the winter of 64-63 BC described Roman forces scattered across their newly conquered territories, with Pompey himself having departed for Syria to complete his eastern reorganization. The king recognized that Roman control over his former domains remained tenuous, dependent on garrison forces that were insufficient to maintain permanent control over hostile populations while simultaneously defending against external threats. More significantly, his agents reported growing discontent within Roman territories as the initial euphoria of victory gave way to the harsh realities of increased taxation and military conscription necessary to fund continued eastern operations. These observations formed the foundation for what would become Mithridates' most desperate and ambitious strategic conception, a massive invasion of Italy itself, launched not from the familiar territories of Asia Minor but through the barbarian lands of Scythia and Gaul. The plan, which contemporary sources describe in fragments preserved through later Roman historians, envisioned a coordinated assault that would unite the tribal confederations of the northern steppes with the Gallic peoples who'd recently experienced Roman conquest under Caesar. The sheer audacity of this scheme reflected both Mithridates' refusal to accept defeat and his sophisticated understanding of Roman strategic vulnerabilities. As such, an invasion would force Rome to defend its heartland while maintaining control over newly conquered eastern territories. The logistical challenges involved in organizing such an expedition were staggering, requiring the coordination of diverse tribal groups across thousands of miles of hostile territory, while maintaining operational security against Roman intelligence networks. Mithridates' emissaries travelled throughout Scythian territories during 64 BC, negotiating complex alliance agreements with tribal chieftains who possessed both the military capabilities and geographic knowledge necessary for such an undertaking. The Sarmatian cavalry, renowned throughout the ancient world for their mobility and fighting prowess, represented the core of potential military support, while various Germanic tribes along the Danube frontier offered additional manpower and strategic diversions that could complicate Roman defensive preparations. The king's diplomatic efforts extended beyond military recruitment to encompass the commercial and political relationships that would be necessary to sustain such an ambitious campaign. Bosporan grain merchants, who had maintained trading connections throughout the Mediterranean world despite the ongoing conflict, provided crucial intelligence about Roman military dispositions and political developments, while offering potential supply networks that could support advancing armies. The wealth that Mithridates had accumulated in the Crimean territories derived primarily from control of the lucrative grain trade between the Scythian steppes and Mediterranean markets, provided financial resources sufficient to purchase weapons, hire mercenaries, and subsidize tribal allies throughout the proposed invasion route. However, the very scope and complexity of these preparations created vulnerabilities that would prove decisive in determining the king's ultimate fate. The multinational character of his proposed alliance required extensive communication networks that were difficult to maintain securely across such vast distances, while the diverse cultural and political traditions of potential allies created opportunities for misunderstanding and betrayal. More significantly, the time required to organise such an elaborate expedition allowed Roman intelligence services to gather information about Pontic activities, while providing opportunities for domestic opponents within Mithridates' own court to organise resistance to what many viewed as a suicidal venture. The growing opposition within the Pontic royal family reflected both practical concerns about the invasion plan's feasibility and deeper questions about the wisdom of continued resistance to Roman power. Pharnaces II, Mithridates' eldest surviving son and designated heir, had observed the systematic destruction of Pontic military power over the previous decades, while witnessing the enormous human and material costs that continued resistance had imposed on their subjects. His education, conducted according to Greek intellectual traditions that emphasized rational analysis and practical wisdom, had provided him with analytical tools for assessing their strategic situation that led to conclusions fundamentally different from his father's continued optimism about eventual victory. The philosophical and political differences between father and son had been developing for several years before they erupted into open conflict during 63 BC. Pharnaces represented a generation of Pontic nobility that had come of age during the long series of wars with Rome and had witnessed first-hand the consequences of challenging Roman military supremacy. His supporters within the court included military commanders who had participated in the disastrous campaigns of recent years, administrative officials who understood the economic devastation that continued warfare had inflicted on Pontic territories, and younger nobles who viewed accommodation with Rome as preferable to the complete destruction that seemed inevitable if resistance continued. The prince's analysis of their strategic position was devastatingly realistic, acknowledging that Roman control over the eastern Mediterranean had become so comprehensive that successful resistance would require resources and capabilities that Pontus no longer possessed. The tribal alliances that his father was attempting to construct might provide sufficient military strength for spectacular raids or even temporary territorial gains, but they could not sustain the kind of prolonged warfare that would be necessary to force Rome to accept meaningful concessions. More fundamentally, the demographic and economic foundations that had supported Pontic resistance during earlier phases of the conflict had been systematically destroyed through decades of warfare, leaving insufficient population and resources to support another major military effort. Pharnaces' supporters argued that continued resistance would result in the complete extinction of the Pontic royal dynasty and the permanent enslavement or exile of their people, while negotiated submission to Roman authority might preserve at least some degree of autonomy and cultural continuity. Roman policy toward defeated enemies had demonstrated considerable variation, ranging from complete destruction to generous client status depending on circumstances and the manner of submission. The prince believed that voluntary surrender, accompanied by genuine cooperation in Roman administrative and military efforts, might secure favourable treatment that would allow the survival of Pontic institutions under Roman oversight. The ideological dimensions of this family conflict extended beyond immediate strategic considerations to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of kingship and the obligations that rulers owed to their subjects. Mithridates represented the traditional Hellenistic conception of monarchy as personal rule by individuals whose exceptional capabilities and divine favour justified unlimited authority and ambitious territorial expansion. His entire identity had been constructed around the role of warrior king who defended Eastern civilization against Roman barbarism, making any acceptance of defeat tantamount to the negation of his life's work and his ancestors' legacy. Pharnaces, by contrast, had been influenced by philosophical traditions that emphasized the ruler's responsibility to promote the welfare of his subjects rather than pursuing personal glory through military adventure. The Stoic concepts that had become increasingly popular among educated Greeks during the Roman period provided intellectual frameworks for understanding kingship as service to the community rather than personal aggrandizement, while practical experience had demonstrated that continued resistance to Roman power would inevitably result in catastrophic suffering for ordinary Pontic citizens who had already endured decades of warfare and economic disruption. The specific catalyst for open rebellion came during the spring of 63 BC, when Mithridates began implementing concrete preparations for the proposed invasion of Italy that required massive mobilization of Bosporan resources and population. The king's orders called for the conscription of virtually every able-bodied male in the Crimean territories, while simultaneously demanding unprecedented levels of taxation and resource requisition to fund the expedition's logistical requirements. These measures, which would have effectively destroyed the economic foundations of Bosporan society, while exposing the civilian population to Roman retaliation, provided Pharnaces with both the justification and the popular support necessary to challenge his father's authority directly. The prince's initial moves against his father were carefully calculated to minimize bloodshed while maximizing the legitimacy of his rebellion within traditional Pontic political frameworks. Rather than attempting direct military confrontation, Pharnaces began by securing the loyalty of key military commanders and administrative officials who had grown disillusioned with the king's increasingly desperate strategic vision. His agents worked systematically to undermine support for the invasion plan, while building coalitions that could provide alternative leadership if circumstances required the removal of Mithridates from active authority. The rebellion's early phases proceeded through political maneuvering rather than open warfare, as Pharnaces sought to present his opposition as loyal concern for royal and dynastic interests, rather than personal ambition or treasonous collaboration with Roman enemies. The prince's supporters argued that Mithridates' advanced age and the enormous stresses of his long reign had impaired his judgment, making intervention necessary to preserve the dynasty and protect their subjects from the consequences of ill-conceived military adventures. This approach allowed them to maintain the fiction of continued loyalty, while systematically isolating the king from sources of military and political support. The psychological impact of this familial betrayal on Mithridates was profound, representing the ultimate failure of the dynastic system that had provided the foundation for his entire political identity. The king had devoted enormous effort throughout his reign to preparing his sons for leadership responsibilities, providing them with the finest available education, while ensuring their exposure to military and administrative challenges that would develop their capabilities as future rulers. The discovery that his designated heir had concluded that submission to Rome represented preferable policy to continued resistance struck at the core of everything Mithridates had believed about kingship, family loyalty, and the destiny of his dynasty. The military dimensions of the developing crisis became apparent during the summer of 63 BC, when units of the Bosporan army began declaring their allegiance to Pharnaces rather than responding to mobilization orders issued by Mithridates. The prince had cultivated relationships with military commanders throughout his adult life, participating in campaigns and sharing the hardships of military service in ways that had built genuine personal loyalty among professional soldiers. His reputation for competence and sound judgment contrasted favourably with perceptions of his father's increasingly erratic strategic decisions, while his promise to end the costly and apparently hopeless conflict with Rome appealed to war-weary veterans. who had witnessed the systematic destruction of their comrades and homeland. The siege of Panticapaeum began in late summer 63 BC, as forces loyal to Pharnaces established control over the approaches to the city while demanding Mithridates' abdication in favour of his son's more realistic policies. The prince's supporters controlled most of the Crimean Peninsula's military resources, while their naval capabilities allowed them to prevent any possibility of external assistance reaching the beleaguered king. More significantly, the civilian population of the Bosporan cities had largely embraced Pharnaces' promise to end the conflict through negotiated settlement with Rome, viewing continued resistance as a path to inevitable destruction rather than glorious victory. Mithridates' final weeks were characterized by a combination of desperate military planning and profound psychological isolation, as he found himself abandoned by virtually all of his former supporters while facing the reality that his life's work had culminated in complete failure. The king's attempts to rally loyal forces were frustrated by the comprehensive nature of his son's rebellion, while his efforts to negotiate some form of compromise were rejected by Pharnaces, who recognised that any agreement short of complete abdication would leave the fundamental conflict unresolved. The old king's physical condition, weakened by decades of stress and the various poisons he'd consumed to build immunity against assassination attempts, deteriorated rapidly under the combined pressures of military defeat and family betrayal. The dramatic circumstances of Mithridates' death on a cold December morning in 63 BC became the subject of numerous ancient accounts that emphasised both the king's personal courage and the tragic irony of his final moments. Contemporary sources describe his discovery that the various toxins he'd ingested throughout his life to prevent assassination had created such immunity to poison that he could not achieve the dignified suicide that ancient tradition prescribed for defeated monarchs. His attempts to end his life through conventional poisoning proved ineffective, forcing him to request assistance from Bituitus, a loyal Gallic bodyguard who had remained faithful despite the general abandonment of his cause. The legendary details surrounding Mithridates' final hours reflect the fascination that his extraordinary career had generated throughout the ancient world, as writers sought to capture both the magnitude of his achievements and the pathos of his ultimate defeat. The image of the great king, who had once commanded vast armies and controlled territories spanning continents, reduced to begging a barbarian mercenary for the final service of death, provided a powerful symbol of the transience of earthly power and the ultimate futility of resistance to Roman destiny. The irony that his legendary immunity to poison, developed as protection against his enemies, ultimately prevented him from escaping the consequences of his final defeat, added an element of cosmic justice that appealed to ancient sensibilities about divine retribution. The immediate aftermath of Mithridates' death saw Pharnaces move quickly to consolidate his control over the remaining Pontic territories, while initiating the diplomatic contacts with Rome that would secure recognition of his legitimacy and define the terms of Pontic submission. The new king's first acts included the execution of remaining supporters of his father's war policies and the systematic dismantling of the military preparations that had been underway for the proposed Italian invasion. These measures demonstrated his commitment to peaceful relations with Rome while eliminating potential sources of future conflict that might provide pretexts for Roman intervention in Bosporan affairs. The negotiations between Pharnaces and Roman representatives proceeded through intermediaries during the early months of 62 BC, as both sides sought to establish arrangements that would satisfy their respective requirements while avoiding the appearance of either abject surrender or excessive Roman generosity toward a former enemy. Pompey, still engaged in organising the eastern settlements that would define Roman policy in the region for generations, recognised that Bosporan cooperation could provide valuable assistance in maintaining control over the Black Sea trade routes while reducing the military commitments necessary to secure Roman interests in the region. The terms that eventually emerged reflected this mutual recognition of practical advantages that could be derived from negotiated settlement rather than continued hostility. The fate of the surviving members of the Pontic royal family became a crucial element in the diplomatic arrangements. as their treatment would serve as both precedent and symbol for Roman policy toward defeated enemies throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Farnes's siblings and other relatives who had supported Mithridates' final resistance were granted safe passage to Roman territories, where they would live under supervision but without the harsh treatment that had characterized previous Roman dealings with captured enemy royalty. This relatively lenient approach reflected both Farnes's negotiating position and Roman recognition that excessive brutality might discourage future voluntary submissions by other potential enemies. The territorial arrangements that concluded the Mithridatic Wars left Farnes in control of the Crimean Bosporus and certain adjacent territories, but under conditions that made his kingdom effectively a Roman client state whose foreign policy would be determined by Roman interests, rather than independent calculation. The new king retained authority over internal administration and local military forces, but was prohibited from conducting independent diplomatic relations with other powers, while being required to provide military assistance to Roman operations when requested. These limitations preserved the fiction of Bosporan independence, while ensuring that the kingdom could never again serve as a base for anti-Roman activities. The economic dimensions of the settlement included substantial indemnity payments that would transfer much of the Bosporan kingdom's accumulated wealth to Roman coffers, while demonstrating the material benefits that accrued to Rome from successful military operations. The grain trade that had provided the foundation for Bosporan prosperity would continue under Roman oversight, with preferential arrangements that guaranteed supplies for Roman markets while generating revenue that could support continued Roman military presence in the region. These commercial arrangements created mutual dependencies that reinforced the political settlement while providing economic incentives for continued cooperation rather than renewed resistance. The systematic pacification of the Black Sea region that followed Mithridates' death involved coordinated diplomatic and military efforts designed to eliminate any remaining sources of potential resistance while establishing Roman influence over the tribal confederations and Greek cities that had previously operated with relative independence. Roman naval forces, now unopposed in Black Sea waters, established permanent bases that could monitor maritime activities while projecting power throughout the region when circumstances required intervention. The diplomatic networks that had connected various anti-Roman factions were systematically dismantled through a combination of incentives for cooperation and punishments for continued hostility. The cultural and intellectual impact of Mithridates' death extended far beyond the immediate political and military consequences, as his extraordinary career had captured the imagination of contemporary observers throughout the Mediterranean world who recognized that they had witnessed the end of an era in the relationship between East and West. The king's resistance to Roman expansion had represented the last serious challenge to Roman hegemony from traditional Hellenistic monarchy, while his death marked the final elimination of the political system that had dominated the eastern Mediterranean since the conquests of Alexander the Great. The symbolic significance of this transition was not lost on ancient writers, who understood that they were documenting the conclusion of a historical epoch that had shaped civilization for centuries. The administrative integration of former Pontic territories into the Roman provincial system proceeded gradually during the years following Mithridates' death, as Roman officials worked to establish governmental structures that could maintain order while extracting revenue from populations that had been devastated by decades of warfare. The challenges involved in this process were substantial, requiring the reconstruction of economic systems, the establishment of reliable taxation mechanisms, and the creation of military arrangements that could prevent future rebellions while minimizing the costs of permanent occupation. The solutions that emerged reflected both Roman administrative experience and the specific conditions that prevailed in these newly acquired territories. The historical legacy of Mithridates VI Eupator would be shaped by both his remarkable achievements and his ultimate failure, as subsequent generations of writers and political leaders sought to understand the lessons that could be drawn from his extraordinary career. His success in creating and maintaining resistance to Roman expansion for over 2 decades demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of challenging established imperial power, while his ultimate defeat illustrated the consequences of strategic overreach and the importance of realistic assessment of relative capabilities. The king's death marked not only the end of his personal struggle against Rome, but the conclusion of the last serious attempt to preserve the independence of the Hellenistic East against Roman imperial expansion. The death of Mithridates VI in 63 BC marked not merely the end of a remarkable individual career, but the conclusion of a transformative period that fundamentally altered the character of Roman military doctrine, imperial administration, and constitutional governance. The 3 wars that had consumed nearly 3 decades of Roman attention and resources left indelible marks on every aspect of Republican society, from the tactical innovations developed in Anatolian mountain passes to the constitutional precedents established by extraordinary commands that would ultimately contribute to the Republic's transformation into an empire. The military lessons learned during the extended Eastern campaigns revolutionized Roman approaches to siege warfare, logistics, and provincial defense in ways that would influence imperial strategy for centuries. The sophisticated fortifications encountered in Pontic cities like Sinope and Amisus forced Roman engineers to develop new techniques for undermining defensive walls and coordinating complex assault operations. The innovations pioneered during Lucullus's methodical sieges included improved artillery designs, more effective battering rams, and systematic approaches to investment that minimize casualties while maximizing psychological pressure on defenders. These technical advances, refined through years of practical application against determined enemies, became standard elements of Roman military engineering that would prove decisive in subsequent campaigns throughout the empire. The logistical challenges posed by operations across the vast distances of Asia Minor compelled fundamental changes in Roman supply systems and communication networks. Traditional methods of provisioning armies through local requisition proved inadequate for sustained operations in territories where populations remained hostile and agricultural production had been disrupted by years of warfare. Roman quartermasters developed sophisticated depot systems that could maintain supply lines extending hundreds of miles from secure bases, while establishing standardized procedures for organizing local recruitment and resource allocation that reduced dependence on distant Roman territories. The administrative structures created to manage these complex logistical requirements became models for subsequent provincial organization throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The naval innovations necessitated by Pontic control of Black Sea trade routes led to significant improvements in Roman maritime capabilities and strategic doctrine. The Republic's traditionally limited naval forces were expanded and reorganized to conduct sustained operations in unfamiliar waters while coordinating with land-based campaigns across multiple theatres. Roman shipwrights developed new vessel designs optimized for the particular conditions of Eastern Mediterranean warfare, while naval commanders learned to integrate maritime operations with siege warfare and coastal assault techniques. The permanent naval bases established during these campaigns provided foundations for Roman control over eastern trade routes that would generate enormous revenue for centuries. Perhaps most significantly, the Mithridatic Wars demonstrated the necessity of professional military leadership capable of conducting complex operations across extended time periods, without the constraints of annual magistracies that had traditionally limited Roman strategic planning. The extraordinary commands granted to Sulla, Lucullus, and Pompey established precedents for concentrating military and civilian authority in single individuals who possessed both the expertise and continuity necessary for effective Eastern administration. These arrangements, while successful in achieving military objectives, created constitutional innovations that fundamentally altered the relationship between military commanders and civilian government in ways that would prove decisive in the Republic's eventual transformation. The economic and demographic consequences of the wars devastated large portions of Asia Minor, while simultaneously generating enormous wealth that would fuel Roman expansion for generations. The systematic destruction accompanying military operations displaced hundreds of thousands of civilians who had formed the backbone of urban and rural communities throughout the region. The massacre of Roman and Italian civilians during the initial uprising, followed by brutal Roman retaliation against Greek populations suspected of collaboration, created cycles of violence that eliminated much of the skilled artisan and merchant classes that had provided economic vitality to major cities. Archaeological evidence from sites like Pergamon and Ephesus reveals substantial population decline during this period, with many residential areas abandoned and commercial districts reduced to ruins that would require decades to rebuild. The disruption of traditional agricultural systems proved particularly devastating for rural populations who had maintained stable farming communities for centuries. Roman taxation policies, designed to extract maximum revenue from conquered territories, imposed financial burdens that exceeded the productive capacity of agricultural communities, already weakened by military destruction and population displacement. The publicani system, reformed after the initial disasters but still focused primarily on revenue generation, created conditions that forced many small farmers into debt servitude while concentrating land ownership in the hands of Roman investors and local collaborators. These changes fundamentally altered social structures throughout Asia Minor, replacing traditional patterns of land tenure with commercial agriculture oriented toward Roman markets rather than local subsistence. The long-term effects of Roman tax policies extended beyond immediate economic hardship to encompass systematic changes in commercial relationships and urban development that would characterize the region for centuries. Greek cities that had maintained relative prosperity through maritime trade and craft production found their traditional economic foundations undermined by Roman commercial competition and regulatory interference. The preferential treatment accorded to Roman merchants, combined with the systematic confiscation of property belonging to those who had supported Pontic resistance, created new patterns of economic dependency that favoured Roman interests while limiting opportunities for local recovery and development. The demographic impact of the wars included not only direct casualties from military operations, but also the massive population movements that resulted from systematic enslavement, voluntary migration, and administrative relocations implemented by both sides during the conflict. Roman sources indicate that hundreds of thousands of prisoners were sold into slavery throughout the Mediterranean world, while substantial numbers of Greek civilians fled to territories beyond Roman control rather than submit to occupation by forces they viewed as barbarian conquerors. These population transfers disrupted traditional cultural and economic relationships while creating labour shortages in some regions and overcrowding in others that would influence regional development for generations. The political consequences of the Mithridatic Wars for the Roman Republic proved even more transformative than their immediate military and economic effects. The extraordinary commands necessitated by the scope and complexity of Eastern operations established precedents for concentrating unprecedented authority in individual commanders who operated largely beyond the oversight mechanisms that had traditionally constrained Roman magistrates. Sulla's march on Rome demonstrated that military commanders could use armed force to resolve domestic political disputes, while the extended tenures granted to Lucullus and Pompey showed that successful generals could build independent power bases that rivaled the authority of traditional republican institutions. The rise of powerful military commanders as political actors fundamentally altered the dynamics of Roman governance by creating alternative sources of authority that competed with the Senate and popular assemblies for control over policy decisions. Pompey's eastern settlement, implemented through his extraordinary command, established territorial and administrative arrangements that would govern Roman policy in the region for centuries, yet these crucial decisions were made by a single individual operating thousands of miles from Rome, rather than through the collective deliberation that Republican theory prescribed for such momentous choices. The precedent established by this concentration of authority provided models for subsequent strongmen who would use military success to justify claims to supreme power. The financial resources generated by successful Eastern campaigns created new patterns of political competition that emphasized military achievement over traditional qualifications for high office. The enormous wealth captured from Pontic treasuries and Armenian cities enabled successful commanders to fund electoral campaigns and public works projects on scales that dwarfed the resources available to politicians who had pursued conventional civilian careers. This shift toward military routes to political advancement encouraged ambitious Romans to seek overseas commands where victory could provide both the financial resources and popular reputation necessary for domestic political success. The constitutional breakdown that accelerated during the Mithridatic period reflected deeper tensions within Roman society about the proper relationship between military and civilian authority in an expanding imperial system. Traditional republican institutions had been designed for governing a city-state and its immediate territories, not for administering vast overseas provinces that required specialized knowledge and sustained attention from experienced officials. The extraordinary commands that proved necessary for effective Eastern administration demonstrated that republican constitutional arrangements were inadequate for imperial governance, yet the alternatives that emerged concentrated dangerous levels of power in individuals whose primary qualifications were military rather than administrative or legal. The precedents established by the Eastern commands influenced subsequent political developments that would ultimately destroy the republican system entirely. The alliance between Pompey, Caesar and Crassus that dominated Roman politics during the 50s BC built directly on the model of extraordinary authority that had been developed during the Mithridatic Wars, while Caesar's conquest of Gaul followed strategic and political patterns that had been pioneered during the Eastern campaigns. The civil wars that destroyed the Republic emerged from conflicts between military commanders who had used overseas victories to build independent power bases that could challenge traditional governmental authority. The historical assessment of Mithridates VI as the last great opponent of Roman expansion reflects both his remarkable personal achievements and his symbolic significance as the final representative of Hellenistic resistance to Roman hegemony. His ability to maintain organised opposition to Roman power for over 2 decades, despite suffering numerous military defeats and territorial losses, demonstrated both exceptional personal resilience and sophisticated understanding of the strategic and political factors that could be exploited to challenge apparently overwhelming Roman advantages. The king's success in creating and maintaining alliance networks that spanned continents while coordinating military operations across multiple theatres revealed strategic capabilities that matched or exceeded those of his Roman opponents. Mithridates' role in preserving Hellenistic culture and political traditions during a period of systematic Roman expansion provided inspiration for subsequent resistance movements throughout the Mediterranean world while demonstrating that alternative forms of political organisation remained viable despite Roman military supremacy. The king's court at Sinope maintained Greek intellectual traditions and artistic patronage that would otherwise have been eliminated by Roman cultural homogenization, while his administrative innovations preserved local autonomy and cultural diversity in ways that contrasted favourably with Roman standardization and exploitation. The survival of Greek cultural institutions in the Black Sea region through the Mithridatic period ensured continuity that would prove crucial for later cultural developments. The broader significance of the Mithridatic Wars in the transition from republic to empire extends beyond their immediate political and military consequences to encompass fundamental changes in Roman attitudes toward imperial governance and cultural diversity. The Eastern campaigns demonstrated both the enormous potential rewards of overseas expansion and the institutional changes that would be necessary to exploit those opportunities effectively. The wealth and territory acquired through victory over Mithridates provided material foundations for the imperial system that would emerge under Augustus, while the administrative and military innovations developed during the Eastern Wars provided practical models for governing diverse populations across vast distances. The cultural impact of sustained contact with Eastern civilizations during the Mithridatic period influenced Roman intellectual and artistic development in ways that would characterize the imperial period. Roman exposure to Greek philosophical traditions, Persian administrative methods, and various Eastern religious practices created synthetic cultural forms that combined Roman political and military institutions with Eastern learning and artistic sophistication. The libraries, artworks, and scholarly traditions captured during the Eastern campaigns provided intellectual resources that would fuel Roman cultural development for centuries, while demonstrating the benefits that could be derived from systematic exploitation of conquered territories. The strategic lessons learned during the Mithridatic Wars influenced Roman imperial policy throughout subsequent centuries, as emperors and their advisors drew on Eastern precedents when confronting similar challenges in other frontier regions. The techniques developed for managing hostile populations, organising complex alliance networks, and coordinating operations across multiple theatres provided models that would be applied during campaigns in Britain, Germany, and Parthia. The administrative structures created for governing diverse Eastern populations became templates for provincial organisation throughout the empire, while the military innovations pioneered during the Eastern campaigns influenced tactical doctrine and strategic planning for generations. The Mithridatic Wars thus represent a crucial watershed in ancient history, marking the end of the Hellenistic period that had begun with Alexander's conquests and the emergence of Roman imperial dominance that would characterise the Mediterranean world for the next 5 centuries. Mithridates' death in the remote Crimean territories where his ancestors had first established their power provided a fitting conclusion to the last serious attempt to preserve Eastern independence against Roman expansion. The king's extraordinary career, spanning from his youthful exile in the Pontic mountains to his final desperate plans for invading Italy itself, embodied both the possibilities and limitations of individual resistance to imperial power, while demonstrating the historical forces that would ultimately transform the ancient world from a collection of independent kingdoms and city-states into a unified empire governed from Rome. The legacy of these transformative conflicts extended far beyond their immediate participants to influence the course of Western civilization for millennia, as the institutional innovations and cultural syntheses that emerged from the Eastern campaigns provided foundations for the imperial system that would preserve and transmit classical learning through the collapse of the ancient world and into the modern era. The death of Mithridates VI marked not only the end of an extraordinary individual career, but the conclusion of an entire historical epoch, as the last great king of the Hellenistic East succumbed to the inexorable expansion of Roman power that would ultimately unite the Mediterranean world under a single imperial system.